This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney.
Donald Trump needs a weak dollar.
Have we achieved the soft landing? Has the Fed kind of done its job?
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
The economic calendar jam-packed today.
And Michael Barr with news. Fears over a broader regional war in the Middle East. The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Tom Keene, Paul Sweeney, Michael Barr on assignment, and Lisa Mateo with us, including our desk in London this morning. We'll go to Ross Matheson here in a moment on the news of Ukraine and the news of an American missile. Paul, what I note is the bond market clearly moves on this news.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of a move in the bond market here, Tom. As you mentioned, we got the yields coming in slightly. The 2-year at 4.25%, and the 10-year 4.37%. Both of them in around 3 or 4 basis points here, Tom.
Round trip 10-year real yield comes in substantially to 2.03%. That's a substantial 48-hour move on a lower inflation-adjusted 10-year yield. I do want to note what's not moving. Oil doesn't move. No. Paul Sweeney's going to explain.
Exactly. I'm going to defer to Alex Steele here. Alex Steele is our energy expert, but we're sitting here right at just below $69 per barrel, Tom, for WTI crude oil. I think that kind of just goes to the demand side of the equation. And where's China going to be on the margin?
We got futures down, a lot of red on the screen, but equity's not moving like bonds. The VIX goes out to a 17 level. Let's do this. Let's get to the market check, and then Ross Matheson and Queen Victoria Street from the Interactive Broker Studios, our Bloomberg Business Flash. Lisa Mateo.
And we've got stocks slumping with European equities shedding 1%. This is all worries over the latest escalation in Russia's war against Ukraine. So right now we have NASDAQ futures down 0.2%, 46 points. Dow futures down 0.5%, 232 points. S&P futures down 0.3%, or 20 points. We head over to the Stock 600 right now, down 0.8%. The DAX in Germany, CAC in Paris, down more than 1%. Over to the bond market, the 2-year yield 4.25%. That's down 3 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.38%, and that's down 3 basis points. Checking with currency, the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index up about 0.1%. We have the Japanese yen stronger, euro, British pound down about 0.3%. Bitcoin right now up about 0.5% at around 91,000. Want to check in with defense stocks? You have Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics both up more than 1%. We take you over to earnings right now. Lowe's raised its sales forecast for the year, higher spending on home improvement in the pro category. But here's the thing, shares are down more than 1%. Guessing it just wasn't enough to reassure investors that the home improvement market's headed back to normal. Then you have Walmart. Right now it's seeing it just coming in across the terminal. Full year adjusted EPS was higher than expected. And shares right now, they're up about 0.5%. And finally, Finnish sports goods maker Amer Sports, you know them, they make Wilson Sporting Goods, reported third quarter earnings. Yes, the tennis rackets. Third quarter earnings that beat estimates. ADRs up about 0.3%. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom and Paul.
Lisa Mateo, thanks so much. Paul, let's do Walmart here quickly, because that's where I first met Ross Matheson, was aisle 7 at a Walmart. I got constructive comp sales estimate up 4%. Ex-gasoline up a large 7%, and the stock moves $3. I mean, this is it's what Gina Martin Adams is talking about.
Yeah, I love the headline for Bloomberg News. They capture it. Walmart raises outlook on strong spending from value seekers, Tom. I think that's kind of where we're seeing the consumer going here, just looking for value across the board as the consumer continues to deal with inflation.
We'll have much more on this. We have a headline out moments ago. Russia confirms the ATACMS missile strike in Bryansk region. Perfect timing. That from IFX. Perfect timing to speak to someone who's had a sleepless night. Ross Matheson joins us, driving all of our government and particularly European continental news. Roz, what will be the political response? What does Germany do? What does Poland do? What does Washington do?
Well, obviously, some of this was to be expected because the US has authorized Ukraine to use these longer range missiles, these Western-made longer range missiles on Russian soil in limited fashion. And in fact, this is what this strike was. If you look where it hit, it was actually about 75 miles from the border with Ukraine. So very much in what we think of as the sphere of conflict at the moment. Ukrainian troops are operating in those
Right.
areas. It was an ammunition dump. So, within the realm of to be expected, but obviously coming in the background of the announcement today, timed obviously
Right.
for this, that, Vladimir Putin saying that he signed off on these changes to the nuclear doctrine,
Yeah.
which were enacted some months ago. So very, very tense environment. And here, what
Right.
are we going to see countries in Europe do? Well, we saw Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, call Vladimir Putin directly, but what
Right.
really is the chessboard is they're all positioning, and Europe is trying to get Ukraine in the strongest position possible for the reality that at some point next year they're probably going to have to negotiate.
Roz, we've got the distinction here that in the modern missile, there's always a defense. Israel will have a shield. Saudi Arabia will have a shield from Yemen. This is a 40-year-old technology from Ling Temco Vote. It's basically an older missile, but Roz, it goes Mach 3. Is the real issue here that Russia feels so naked because they really flat out can't defend against a given missile 150 miles into Russia?
Well, in a way, Russia expected this to happen, and they do have the ability to shoot these missiles down, and even the more advanced, longer-range missiles than the ATACMS. And Russia has pretty good air defenses, and certainly they've been working on that around places like Moscow in the more recent months as Ukraine has moved further and further sort of into overt attacks on Russia. Ukraine has had very good air defenses because Russia's been sending their most sophisticated missiles at Ukraine now for years. So they do have very good air defenses. I mean, obviously, one of these things penetrating Moscow and landing would be A, embarrassing for Vladimir Putin, and B, force him perhaps to retaliate. So no one seems to want that. The question is, what is the messaging in all of this? And again, it's Russia and Ukraine positioning themselves for a point where, they're going to have to negotiate.
And that's kind of where I want to go, Roz. Kind of what's the thinking these days about potential negotiations here? Again, it just feels like from here in the West that it's just a stalemate there. So what is really the thinking these days about a potential negotiation?
Well, at this point, it seems to be the question of land. We can see the Ukrainian president saying he doesn't want to have to cede territory, but it's clear that Russia has been occupying this territory for several years now, and that's going to be part of any conversation. It's also the reality. You've got the incoming US administration under Donald Trump, and he's made it very clear he doesn't want any more military aid going to Ukraine. He doesn't want financial aid going to Ukraine, and he wants this war to end. So you pull US support for Ukraine, and Europe cannot pick up the entirety of that slack. So it's just a reality that support for Ukraine is going to fade to the point where they're going to have to get to the table.
Roz Matheson, thank you so much. I know an incredibly busy day for you. Roz Matheson driving all of our government coverage. Again, this with futures at negative 17. The VIX out of stick, 16.64. Paul and I noting yield space, as they say, comes in with a vengeance, a 2-year yield in 4 basis points. Joining us now with a larger political economic experience, Veronica Clark, U.S. economist at Citigroup. Veronica, I don't want you to quote on missile trajectory, but I want you to quote on the idea that Russia has an incredibly soft economy. And continental Europe, I mean, the other day Lagarde is actually talking about disinflation and a deflationary vector in Europe. It's Citigroup. How polarized across the Atlantic is weak Europe, stronger U.S. economy?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly are seeing weakness of, in the broader, global economy. Europe, of course, China, a lot of focus on weaker activity in China. And the U.S. does look like a bit of an outlier in that sense. On the surface, a lot of this data are still incredibly strong. We're still running 2 to 3% GDP growth. Unemployment rate is historically low. But we in the U.S., I think, for some time have seen cracks forming, especially in more rate sensitive sectors, housing, manufacturing, small businesses. We have seen the labor market loosening for about a year now. So I don't know if we're so much of an outlier, but certainly relative to the rest of the world, I think there is clear weakness elsewhere.
I'm going to announce my economist of the year. Veronica Clark's not my, but boy, was she on the short list with Andrew Hollenhorst. You guys nailed the up and away call on rates, and now you have a persistency towards lower rates. Do you maintain that in your 400-page year ahead report?
Yes, I don't know if it will be quite that long.
Go to 500 pages.
But yes, we do. Yeah. I mean, and fundamentally, I think that comes down to, we do think, like Fed officials, I think that rates are at restrictive levels. And we are seeing that way on activity. We're seeing that in slowing inflation. So even in slowing inflation alone, I think rates can get back to something that looks a bit more neutral, maybe something at least around 4%, more likely 3%. Maybe the Fed will slow that pace of rate cuts as we get closer. But I think by most estimates, we're still pretty far from that now.
Veronica, as investors try to gauge what a President-elect Trump presidency will look like over the next 4 years, they're just concerned about inflation in some of his economic policies, tax cuts, and the like, and potentially tariffs. And how do you guys think about inflation under a Trump presidency?
Yeah, I think, we obviously need to know a lot more details, about these policies. We need to see them come to fruition first. And it will be some time, I think, before you see this showing up in the data, maybe, second half of next year at the earliest. So it is hard for Fed officials, at least, now to be reacting to something like that. But it is a longer term, risk that we are returning to a higher inflation world in the next, 2 or 3 years.
So let's go to we're getting a lot of retailers reporting earnings today. We got some better than expected numbers. I don't know, out of Lowe's and Walmart here. What's your view of the U.S. consumer these days?
Yeah, there really is a lot of somewhat surprising resilience, and we saw a slowing in consumption maybe earlier in the year, but that seems to have turned around a bit. Of course, we did have retail sales data, for the month of October last week. Headline increase was modest. Control group sales were down a bit, but then we got some pretty big upward revisions. This is a hard time of the year to read into spending patterns. There's volatile seasonal adjustment around the holidays, but spending is very resilient. But I would think that if we do see the labor market turning more, if we do get to the point where we're seeing layoffs, that could turn.
Yeah, 4 out of 5 children need a new laptop. That's what I call consumer spending. Veronica Clark, to stay on Paul's good question about consumer spending, the basic idea here is it's 70% of the economy. Is it polarized? Walmart just out saying value shoppers are adding value. I don't know what that means. But is it a 2-part consumption, or does Citigroup look at it as a 1-part consumption?
Yeah, no, I think there is definitely this bifurcated element of consumers and even businesses in the economy right now where, higher income, larger corporates, that upper end of the spectrum is doing well. But the lower end maybe not so much. And I think, even looking at some of the inflation data, we've seen that dynamic of people really pushing back on further price increases. Goods prices have been pretty modest this whole year. And that's even with, we've seen some increase in shipping costs, and that's just not being passed on this year like it was in previous years. I do think speaking to, there is this weakening underlying the economy.
Veronica, thanks so much. Greatly appreciate it as well. Veronica Clark with Citigroup. Looking at the Walmart chart and some fancy moving averages, Paul. Walmart on a tear from the second week of October.
Yeah,
no other way to put it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm just looking at the stock here. It's it's up 4.25% today, pre-market trading. Up 60% year to date.
Paul, really that much?
Yeah.
Paul, forward PE-ish is 34.
30. I know.
I thought it was like 25, and that was outrageous.
Exactly.
Walmart has a 34 PE.
I thought it was a GDP story, but I guess it's something more than that. But the market cap, $675 billion for our good friends down there in
Maybe
Arkansas.
It's a Mag 7 to come. We'll have to see.
Exactly.
Costco is the way Lisa shops there.
Yep.
We say good morning on YouTube. Subscribe to Bloomberg Podcasts. We are humbled by the growth of YouTube and at YouTube Podcasts as well on your commute. Good morning, Android Auto. Apple CarPlay. I got yelled at again yesterday. Sirius Channel 1. Ari, help me. 121?
120.
121.
Yep.
Sirius Channel 121.
Yep. Good
morning to Sirius across this nation. Stay with us from New York City. Bloomberg Surveillance.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And this Bloomberg Business Flash brought to you by BNY. BNY's expertise and insights can help clients achieve their ambitions. Visit BNY.com. All right, we've got futures falling. Tensions rise in the Russia-Ukraine war. Also, traders monitoring cabinet appointments. Also expected policy shifts from incoming administration as well. So we have NASDAQ futures down about 0.1%, 22 points. Dow futures down 0.4%, 216 points. S&P futures down 0.2%, or 15 points. The two-year yield, 4.24%. That's down 4 basis points. The yield on the 10-year, 4.37%, and that's down 4 basis points. We have gold gaining up 0.7% at $2,632 an ounce. Oil, Brent crude lower, down 0.4%, $72 a barrel. WTI crude, $68 a barrel. We have the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little change. We have the Japanese yen stronger, euro, British pound weaker. Bitcoin back in record territory, climbing above 91,000. It's now at 92,000. Meanwhile, Trump meeting technology and talks to buy digital asset marketplace Backed Holdings. Backed is up 12%. And if that's not enough for you, the NASDAQ set to launch options on BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF today. A lot going on there. Shares of server maker Super Microcomputer still on the rise, are up about 22% right now. And this is after it hired a new auditor, filed a plan to comply with NASDAQ listing requirements. And shares of Nestle down more than 1% in Switzerland. Investors felt its updated guidance, well, it was just a bit too ambitious. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Lisa Mateo. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
We now go to Bloomberg Surveillance Value Reporter Lisa Mateo. What's the difference between aisle 7 at Walmart and aisle 7 at Costco?
It's how much you get for your money, I think.
Costco's just flat
Costco,
out.
you get more for your money, but think about it. You're also spending for the membership for Costco. So I don't know. It's just a thought in my head. I wonder if these other retailers will begin charging memberships.
How much is a membership at Costco?
Depends. If you want the Grand Luxe one that
gets you the hot dog.
Yes, $130 a year.
That's not that much.
It's not that much.
But that gets you in the
door.
door.
Like
It gets you
Amazon
in the
discounts.
door, discount. Everything in.
And the hot dog and a soda is $2.50.
$1.50.
$1.50.
You still get that.
Boom.
Okay, you
Look
get
at
all that
So
stuff.
if you have 98 hot dogs, you break even.
Yes. But it just depends on what you want. If you don't have the room for all the stuff, then you go to Walmart, if you don't have the space.
She said moving 3 carts down the aisle. Lisa Mateo, our surveillance value correspondent. Joining us now, and again with the geopolitical tensions of the morning and the bond market moving, Freya Beamish, chief economist, head of macro research at TS Lombard. Usually we talk to Freya, true expertise on China, but let's audible that today. Freya Beamish, how flat on their economic back is continental Europe?
You know what? I want to focus on some positives for Europe for a change. Otherwise, I'm going to get a name for being bearish on Europe. And I think there's actually a lot of what we're doing now is sort of fading a lot of the Trump trades. And I think there are some positives actually for Europe.
Please.
In the sense Trump has essentially told Europe it needs to get its act together, and one way in which it looks likely to do that is to spend more on defense. Now, the reasons behind that are kind of not very nice, but the reality is that spending on defense is really important in terms of rebalancing the euro area economy. We've always said that there needs to be a greater kind of effort amongst kind of fiscal policymakers within Europe to kind of soak up some of the excess savings. And what we see at this stage, especially with defense, is that probably that is going to rise as a percentage of GDP. It's continuing to rise. It will probably go through the 2% that is required by NATO requirements. And that's really important in the sense that what needs to happen in Europe is that we need to get around a lot of these kind of fiscal rules that are preventing policymakers from doing what they actually need to do on the fiscal front to rebalance the economy. So, for instance, in Germany, where they have the constitutional debt brake, a lot of this could happen by bypassing the constitutional debt brake at a federal level, in the same way as we saw with the Next Generation EU funds. Now, those funds for the countries that were the beneficiaries have actually seemingly have been a sort of a catalyst for private sector investment in machinery, in kind of IP, and those are the types of synergies that we're looking for when we're kind of looking for positive stories within Europe.
Freya, is there, I don't know, I guess political support, popular support to increase defense spending, government spending across the European Union?
I think so, not least just for the geopolitical reasons, with the US pulling back and the kind of the obvious threats, but also if you look at where the companies are that would stand to benefit from these types of expenditures, they are in Germany, they are in France, Italy, even Spain to a certain degree. These are the countries that are going to be benefiting, and therefore the likelihood that actually gets through is greater. Then when we look at Germany, which tends to be the greatest kind of fiscal hawk, there is talk there of kind of military service. There is talk there of needing to address the constitutional debt brake as we have this snap election. The previous finance minister was showing the exit because he wasn't willing to sort of think about those issues. And so there is a shift that has been catalyzed by, if you like, the crisis of Donald Trump saying, yeah, I'm not going to fund that anymore.
An unfair question, but Mr. Trump, the president-elect, is heated that NATO and Europe has to raise their defense spending. When you hear the news this morning, Freya Beamish, of use of U.S. missiles and one landing in Russia, do you look at the eastern front of Europe from Finland on down to Turkey is well defended, or are they naked this morning after decades of non-spending?
In terms of population, in terms of like the level of income, there should really be no threat here, but it's just the fact that there has been such underinvestment for a long period of time. And so, those are kind of real concerns, and that's the crisis that is causing the change in the mindset, where there has been this just very extreme kind of fiscal hawkishness, which I think has been a barrier to European growth. If we look at sort of the 2010s versus what we're expecting in the 2020s for developed markets, I think there is a strong degree of sort of endogeneity to the productivity growth outturn when regards to the mix of policy and that kind of fiscal austerity, how that has held back productivity growth, how that has held the natural rate of interest lower, and now that we're getting that kind of shift at the margin, and this could be a significant shift, particularly with regards to defense, but more broadly looking at the sort of the political shifts that are happening within Europe as well, that actually this could help to push the natural rate of interest higher and push productivity growth higher in the 2020s. So that's a sort of a silver lining to a very scary situation.
Freya, you mentioned productivity, and I just think back to Mr. Macron in France hosting a meeting of world leaders several months ago saying, hey, come to France, invest in France. Is there a commitment to increase productivity across Europe?
I think the only way that we're going to get that, the only way that we're going to get productivity higher is if there is a commitment to allow the economy to run a little bit hotter. And there's been such a great pushback against that in Europe because there's a terror of the wage price spiral. But actually, I think it's the wage growth and the tight labor market that is really necessary for that productivity growth outturn to come through.
Well timed to have Roz Matheson and Freya Beamish with us. Freya, thank you so much for a Continental Europe brief. She's a chief economist, head of macro at T.S. Lombard in London. Torsten Slok's amazing what he can pack into 2 sentences.
I know, exactly.
3 sentences.
Yep.
He's got an add-on of $2 trillion due to Fed hikes into money market funds. And he says, okay, rates are coming down. Where does the money go? And I don't see Walmart or Nvidia here, Paul.
The most likely scenario is that money will leave money market accounts and flow into higher yielding assets such as credit, including investment grade and private credit. That's according to Torsten Slok at Apollo.
I mean, you need a new boat.
I know,
exactly. The yield comes down. Does it flow into a new Grand Banks for you?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we talk about this all the money sitting on the side. $7 trillion. Does it move? I don't know.
Program note here looking forward. We're in about 20 minutes. We are going to go to the surveillance expert on all that has to do with continental Europe, the synthesis of the military with the geopolitical moment, and that is Marc Champion will join us. He is just outstanding. Stay tuned for that. On YouTube, subscribe to Bloomberg Podcasts, YouTube Podcasts. It's great. Stay with us. Bloomberg Surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Stocks slumping after news that President Vladimir Putin pushing ahead to allow Russia to expand its use of atomic weapons. Right now, NASDAQ futures down 0.1%, 25 points. Dow futures down 0.4%, 202 points. S&P futures down 0.2%, or 13 points. We have the two-year yield at 4.24%, down 4 basis points. The yield on the 10-year, 4.37%. That's down 4 basis points. We have the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little change change. We have the Japanese yen stronger, euro, British pound weaker. Checking back in with shares of Lowe's after earnings reports down 1%, Walmart up 4%. Few companies making news. Apple increased its offer to invest in Indonesia. It's in part of an order to persuade the government to lift that sales ban on the iPhone 16. Now, sources are saying it plans to invest almost $100 million in the country over 2 years. And the Department of Justice pushing Alphabet's Google to sell off its Chrome browser. It's going to break up its search monopoly. Now, sources say it's also seeking action on data licensing and also AI measures. And finally, you could start seeing more Jersey Mike's shops. The sandwich chain partnering with Blackstone to speed up its growth. Blackstone acquiring a majority ownership position. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom and Paul.
Lisa, thanks so much. We now go to Jersey Mike's expert, Paul Sweeney here. It's Point?
Point Pleasant, New Jersey.
Point Pleasant,
That's
New
where it's
Jersey.
founded, 1956.
It's a great story. It was 56, and then a kid was 17 and got a loan from his football coach banker. It's amazing. Can you imagine
American
running
story.
Jersey Mike is 17 years old?
Yeah, exactly. And, for those of us in the metro New York area, we've got lots of great local delis. Every town's got a great deli. But if you're not in that part of the world, Jersey Mike's is really good. It's really good. They're fresh. They cut it right there.
And John Gray at Blackstone,
he knows a thing or two.
Four of these a week, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the Gray household.
Yep,
they're just popping Jersey Mike's.
Big valuation, $8 billion enterprise value.
We'll have much more on this from our Jersey Mike's. So what's the thing in Trenton, the sauce or whatever it is? Remember pork?
What's pork roll?
Pork roll.
Yeah, exactly. That's a Trenton thing.
On your commute across the nation on Apple CarPlay, Android.
Go Google that
Washington,
across the country.
Paul Sweeney, Jersey cuisine. We'll get to that in a bit. David Doyle saying, why am I doing this? Head of economics and American coverage lead at Macquarie. We're thrilled he could join us this morning. David, you have a brilliant short essay on what you call king consumer. I would suggest in the last 12, even 24 months, we've grossly underestimated king consumer. Does king consumer keep on consuming?
I think so, Tom. That's right. I mean, the key fundamental driver, I think, of consumption is positive real wage growth. And what the benefit of that has been is that inflation has come in much more sharply than wage growth. And so you have average hourly earnings of roughly 4%, and you have PCE inflation hovering around 2.5%. So that gives you a lift of plus 1.5% real wage growth. And I think that helps to propel consumption. You layer on some jobs growth, and the consumer is underpinned by solid fundamentals in our view.
Well, how much of the consumption is the rich people, the haves versus the have-nots? Is it a discrete or polarized consumption?
I don't see it that way. I mean, from what we've looked at when it comes to wage gains, it's been broad-based. So when you look at wages as being the driver of consumption, that broad-based wage gains, we think, is propelling things across the spectrum of income earners. Now, you may see some disproportionate gains from higher income earners due to the wealth effect from the strength in equity markets. But overall, we think it's almost all income groups that are participating.
So underpinning the consumer, David, oftentimes is the labor market. What's your sense of the labor market here? 4.1% sounds like full employment to me, but there are some credible voices out there that are saying maybe it's not as strong as we think it is.
Yeah, I think that's right, Paul. I mean, you have some cracks in the labor market. So job openings have fallen quite sharply. Some signs of a softening in sort of the breadth of payrolls growth. So not everything is perfect when it comes to the labor market. But I think the key is that layoffs and the signal that we get on that front is from jobless claims remain very low, right? So what's happening, I think, and what's caused this little bit of a lift up in the unemployment rate hasn't been, someone who's been earning an income that's lost their job, which of course has knock-on effects on consumption. It's been, the university graduate that's joining the labor force that hasn't been able to find a job. So, and of course that matters. The Fed should respond to that, but there's far different consequences for the economy that flow through. So we think overall the labor market seems to be okay-ish. It is something that we are watching for 2025 though.
So given that backdrop here, a decent labor market, inflation generally down close to where the Fed would like to see it. What do you think the Fed does over the next several meetings?
So I think Powell's been pretty clear, right? They're looking to slow the pace of reductions in the Fed funds rate. So we'll see what happens in December. I think the market's on the fence on that. I think a lot of that story will be told by the incoming data over the next few weeks. But it seems to me as though they're moving from the signal that they sent in September, which was that you should expect regular cuts, to being, look, it's really dependent on the data, and we may not proceed with the degree or magnitude of cuts that they signaled back in September. So I think it's very data dependent at this point in time, and it probably doesn't come with the regular cadence that maybe some were expecting a few weeks ago.
And David Doyle, unfair question to an economist, but I'm going there because I think it's too important. Right at the top of the Bentonville, Arkansas release this morning is Walmart global e-commerce sales grew 27%. Global advertising business, I'm assuming all digital, grew 28%. Do we economists and people like us, do we all underestimate the power of technology to give us profit and revenue and GDP in America?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's been a lot written on the potential measurement issues in that respect, and potentially that, the way that they run the national accounts doesn't fully capture the extent to which you get improvement. But for my job, that sort of is something that we think the U.S. is already doing pretty well on the productivity growth, already doing really well on real GDP per capita growth, already doing really well on tech investment. So it's sort of a secondary consideration in that context. Maybe for some other economies where things have been more meandering, I would say that issue could be more brought to the forefront. But for the U.S., even if you are under measuring it, you're really doing really well.
He's too optimistic to be on this show. David Doyle, are you popping 5% nominal GDP? Is that what I'm hearing here?
That looks to be the run rate, right? So we're running, what's the Atlanta Fed right now? GDP now is around 2.5%. Yeah. Inflation's 2.5%, maybe even a little bit firmer than that. So that gets you to 5%. And that feels like it's the run rate at this point.
What do you think, Paul? He can never be on again? He's too optimistic.
Too optimistic.
I mean, it's
exactly.
Drive time America. You don't want all this optimism.
David, what happens?
Terry Weissman gives us some negative tone. Come on.
Exactly. David, we got President-elect Trump about to enter office here, and we've seen some of his economic policies, just a little bit on the margin, tax cuts, tariffs. Does that raise inflation concerns for you?
Yeah, I mean, we are mindful, particularly on the tariff front, of what that could mean for inflation. And of course, that we think could provide some moderation in that real wage growth lift that we were talking about when it comes to the consumer, potentially in the middle of next year. A lot is uncertain on that front, though. So we're looking at it now. We're digging into it. But we do think you'll see some volatility on the tariff front, particularly as you get into the middle of the year. We think this is real. And I think the economic implications will depend upon how much is a negotiation and how much is actually implemented.
David, thank you so much. Brilliant work, particularly on the American consumer. Mr. Doyle, head of economics of the Americas at Macquarie as well. We're busting chops. I mean, we get some optimistic people.
Yeah, we can do that. We can do that.
Are you ready?
Sure.
I'm scheduled to name my Economist of the Year today.
Oh boy,
it's amazing.
See who's in the running there.
It's. I've been in intense discussions with John Tucker about this.
Yep, he knows what's going on.
Economist of the Year.
Do they have to be living?
Yeah, they do. It's like the Nobel Prize. They have to be living.
Well, I'm going to guess it's not like the Nobel Prize, but
probably
not.
Neil Dutta was our economist last year.
Yeah, solid.
Solid effort. He was optimistic about what's going on.
Yeah.
And you just heard that from David Doyle.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul, there's a lot of gloom out there, and it had to do with the election.
Yeah, sure. And I think a lot of that has been lifted. It feels like when you just kind of look at the markets here. But David Doyle talking about potentially a nominal GDP, around 5%. Yeah. That is solid.
You mentioned that headline. Walmart raises outlook on strong spending from value seekers.
Yep.
With our news in New York City with futures, -18 value seeker John Tucker.
All right, Tom and Paul, Ukrainian forces carried out their first strike at a border region in Russia using Western-supplied missiles. This is the first known attack following the decision by President Biden's administration to approve Kiev's limited use of the weapons to hit targets inside Russia. These attacks come as Russian President Vladimir Putin today approved an updated nuclear doctrine. that allows Russia to expand its use of atomic weapons. More on that end of the story in this report from Bloomberg's Courtney Donahoe.
It comes days after the U.S. gave Ukraine limited permission for long-range missile strikes on Russian territory. Putin signed a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to a massive conventional attack on its soil, including drones. The Russian leader has warned the U.S. and its European allies against allowing Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia using Western long-range, high-precision weapons, saying this would bring them into direct conflict with his country. Courtney Donahoe, Bloomberg Radio.
And sources say President-elect Trump's transition team is considering pairing Kevin Warsh, the former Federal Reserve official, in the Treasury Secretary role with hedge fund manager Scott Bessent as director of the White House National Economic Council. Both Warsh and Bessent are seen as having Wall Street pedigrees that Trump has been seeking to lead his economic team, and each has the support of many advisors close to the president-elect. One of Joe Biden's main Middle East envoys landed in Beirut this morning as the U.S. steps up efforts to clinch a ceasefire between Lebanese militant group Hezbollah and Israel. Amos Hochstein, who handles Israel-Hezbollah affairs for the White House, will discuss a U.S. drafted proposal to end the war between the two sides. And SpaceX slated to launch its gargantuan Starship rocket today out of South Texas. This is a key test, and it's expected to include a visit from President-elect Trump. One of the most anticipated moments is going to come about 7 minutes into the mission when the company will attempt to catch the Super Heavy booster in midair with those giant mechanical arms referred to as chopsticks, repeating the groundbreaking feat from the previous flight. Global news, 24 hours a day, and whatever you wanted with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg Poll and Tom.
Any time roughly on that, plus or minus a number of hours?
A really good reporter would have put that down, but
Michael Barr would have.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
Michael's, I got to check in on him. He's due back next week.
He's due back. I did not know that.
I think.
He's on assignment. Actually, folks, he's traveling with the Detroit Lions. I mean, to be honest,
reveling in their success.
We tried to keep it quiet. Thank you, Ari, saving the day. 5 o'clock tonight, looking for SpaceX here in the sunset of Texas. Right by the Midtown Tunnel, Jersey Mike Subs.
Yeah.
307 West 38th Street.
Okay.
It's also on East 33rd Street. You can go right down Lexington.
Yeah.
It screams road trip.
It does. We used to have one right around the corner. They closed it, and I'll speak for most of Global Bloomberg here in New York. We were crushed because so many people
John Gray will reopen it.
Yeah, I know.
Blackstone
exactly. We'll get him
going
at it. Take care of his friends at Bloomberg. So we depended upon that. But no, it's good. I think it's very good.
And
Based
you mentioned
in Manahawkin, was it?
Point Pleasant.
No, well, they started in Point Pleasant, I think.
But they have their training facility in Manahawkin.
Manasquan?
No. Yes. You're right.
Boy,
yes.
this is just this room is just a font of knowledge.
It's just
there's too much.
What time's the rocket? Where is Jersey Mike's? Approximately.
Yes.
Probably they'll be serving Jersey Mikes for the president-elect and
Exactly.
Mr. Musk today.
No, they were eating
Rocket
McDonald's.
Lunch.
I saw there on the Trump plane
They
just
were.
recently.
Did you see that?
I saw that. They were happy.
Young Kennedy was downing a number 2 value meal. See about that. Futures at -16, Dow futures -217. Some equity movement here off a missile from Ukraine. An American missile was the report, 150 miles in over the Russian border. The bond market reacts with a 2-year yield down 4 basis points. We're on YouTube. Subscribe to Bloomberg Podcasts at YouTube. Good morning.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. We've got stocks falling after Ukrainian forces reportedly carried out their first strike on a border region of Russia using Western-supplied missiles. We have NASDAQ futures down 0.1%, 37 points. Dow futures down 0.5%, 220 points. S&P futures down 0.2%, or 16 points. We have the 2-year yield 4.25%. That's down 2 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.38%, and that's down 3 basis points. We have the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little change. We have the Japanese yen stronger, euro, British pound weaker. Gold gaining, spot gold up about 0.8% at $2,633 an ounce. We have oil, Brent crude down about 0.2%, $73 a barrel. WTI crude, $68 a barrel. More data on the housing market released today, 8:30 Wall Street time. We get a read on housing starts, building permits. Then Thursday, it's on to existing home sales and also initial jobless claims for last week. And when it comes to interest rates, Bank of America changing its tune. Analysts now predict the Fed's easing cycle will end earlier in June with fewer rate cuts. Few companies making news. Novo Nordisk launching its Wegovy obesity drug in China. It's at a lower price than in the U.S. According to online listings, a 1-month supply of the starter dose will cost just over $193 compared to the more than $1,300 list price in the U.S. Its ADR is up 0.5%. And SpaceX set to launch its Starship rocket this afternoon out of South Texas with an expected visit from President-elect Donald Trump. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Lisa, thanks so much. Bloomberg Surveillance this morning brought to you by IBKR. IBKR Financial Advisors switch to interactive brokers for lowest cost, global trading and turnkey custody solutions, no ticket charges, no conflicts of your interests. See ibkr.com/RIA. ibkr.com/RIA. If you do a 5-year tour of duty at the Moscow Times, if you work for the Independent, London, the Wall Street Journal, and most of it is east of the Eastern Front, you know more than anyone else out there. Marc Champion is definitive on Russia and on Mr. Putin. He joins us this morning of Eastern Front tension. Marc Champion, just a basic question. Is Russia behind Mr. Putin, or is this Putin alone?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, to the extent it matters, Russia is behind Putin. I say that in that way just because you don't have to have the whole country, cheering on the war, wanting to continue the war, in order for them to ultimately say, Putin is the Russian state, and he decides what is best for the Russian state, and I will therefore, back that. But it is a complicated question. There isn't sort of, visceral support for the war, but he has what he needs.
The missile distinction to me of the Lockheed Martin Ling Temco vote, ATACMS, is it's going at Mach 3. Is there a nakedness here where Russia feels they simply can't defend against this missile 150, 190 miles into Russia?
It is a very sophisticated missile. People often talk about it as a long-range missile. It's not. It's a tactical missile. It has a maximum range of about 190 miles. And it will have reached that. This first time that it's been used in Russia, it will have reached that because it has to sit behind the lines, obviously, which in turn are behind, are further into Ukraine. The Russians will be somewhat concerned, but I think for a number of reasons, it's a little bit, performative. One is that Ukraine's not going to have a lot of them. The U.S. doesn't have a lot of them. It won't have given very many to Ukraine. The second is that the range is quite limited. Although we do talk about it as long, it's longer than a HIMARS, uses the same launch platform, but it does have a longer range. Both the Ukrainians now, they make their own missiles now, which have a range of 1,500 kilometers, ballistic missiles. What they lack there is money to produce them. But they are using them. And the Russians, of course, they have a whole range of missiles that are much more powerful than the ATACMS. The real question is, what does Putin want to do with this politically? He has used it, as he always does, to make a kind of nuclear threat that we're heading for World War III, nuclear Armageddon, all that sort of thing. Nuclear is extremely difficult to use, and that's why he hasn't yet. But you will see him escalate. He is responding. He has given, anti-ship missiles to the Houthis, and he has said, I can give stuff to your enemies just as you give stuff to ours. Also, mysteriously, 2 cables under the Baltic Sea connecting, Finland and to Lithuania and Sweden to, I'm getting that backwards, Sweden to Lithuania and Finland to Germany, both appear to have been cut. This is another area, very kind of, fruitful potential area for Russia to respond.
Mark, there seems to have been increased rhetoric here, maybe just since the U.S. election, of a negotiated peace here with this war here. Is that something that Ukraine wants at this time, or do they feel that maybe Russia has much more of the leverage? Even Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz made a phone call recently to that end. Where do we stand about a negotiated peace?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The Ukrainians are very worried that there will be a precipitous peace, also rather peace talks. And the difficulty there is that at the moment, Zelensky is actually very clear about this. At the moment, Putin and the Russians have very little, if any, incentive to negotiate. So they have made it clear, and again, Scholz, I think unwisely, made that call to Putin without coordinating with anybody. And the response that he got, according to his own readout of the call, was, we stand by our goals, and there's I'm not interested in the kind of peace solutions that are being talked about, and our goals are amount to the surrender of Ukraine.
Mark, how do you respond? And I'm quoting this loosely, folks, that the president-elect says he can fix Ukraine in one day. Just as don't quote me on that, folks, but just the general tone that you hear from the president-elect. If he fixes Ukraine in one day, who's he speaking to?
Well, he's speaking to his own audience, and that was that quote, which has been used a lot. I've used it. That was during the election campaign season, I'm not too bothered by that.
Right.
The question is which day.
I got 1 minute left, Marc Champion. I've been dying to ask you this because you'd be the one. Have you seen the new restored Notre Dame in Paris?
I have not. I've actually been meaning to go over and see it, but I haven't.
We'll get to. When you do, email have your people, Mark, email my people when you go see the new Notre Dame. I would be honored for you to give us the first report on this great French restoration. Marc Champion, of course, writing for Bloomberg Opinion, can't say enough about his perspective east of the Eastern Front. Paul, Walmart, I'm still blown away. I mean, 35. It's got growthiness.
It does, and it better have.
How do you do growthiness in big box retail? It's an amazing story.
I guess it is. I guess it's just kind of a market share story, Tom. You go Walmart versus the Costco's and the Targets, where does Lisa Mateo spend her discretionary dollars? I don't know. But that seems to be kind of the play, because when you look at a big retailer the size of Walmart, I mean, how do you model out anything other than just kind of GDP top-line growth? But there's definitely been some margin improvement, and they're going to throw off a ton of free cash flow, which a lot of investors like. A lot of investors feel like this is a kind of a safe bet, if you will. But I'm looking at the revenue growth going out the next 3 or 4 years. It's kind of right around GDP.
If you grow up on the Mississippi, like Natchez, Mississippi, and then when you're a kid you move to Houston, I mean, there's a Walmart everywhere you go.
Yep.
That's what it's like.
But look at the EBITDA margins.
Oh, listen
6%. I mean, that's it. This is retail. This is, you're living and dying by these tiny margins here. 3% profit margin. They're getting it done big time. $12 billion of free cash flow this year. $15 billion of free cash flow next year. How about that?
This is we're doing Stand By Me today. Mickey Gilley, one of the great stories of Nashville, to the #1 years ago. Urban Cowboy.
And the land is dark, and the moon is the only light we'll see. Though I walk be afraid. Oh, I won't be afraid, just as long as you stand by me.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney.
What do you say to people scared stiff in cash?
We've got an administration, presumably, that will be pro-business, lower taxes.
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
AI affecting demand for cloud computing.
And Michael Barr with news.
Israel ratchets up offensives in Lebanon and Gaza.
The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Paul Sweeney, Tom Keene, Michael Barr on assignment. He'll be back from the Detroit Lions here in a week or two, I'm told. He's really 9-1 or something.
Crushing
Kansas
it.
City
I mean,
finally
so much
loses.
success in Detroit. Yep.
You know, I mean, he's helping out with the defensive strategy there.
Yeah.
Also, when they score a touchdown, the dances that they do. Michael Barr's helping with that.
Okay.
Well, Lisa Mateo with us here. She'll have the Bloomberg Business Flash. We're looking at economics, finance, investment. But as you heard from Roz Matheson and Marc Champion, tensions in Europe. You see it in the bond market, mostly where the Sweeney yield comes in 5 basis points. Now the 10-year real yield collapses over the last 48 hours from 2.12 down to 2.02%. And Paul, really the story here is the market okay, but oil doesn't move.
Oil does not move, Tom. I mean, looking at here, let's look at Brent crude, the global crude, off just about 0.5% here, just below $73 per barrel. Had been well north of 80 just recently.
Got an announcement coming up. We'll do that here.
Okay.
In a moment. Tina Fordham just booked in a thrilling to go to London to speak to Tina Fordham here at 8:15. Bloomberg Surveillance this morning. We're brought to you by Cohn Resnick Advisory Assurance Tax. Discover optimization strategies that are helping CFOs make their finance function more competitive and more resilient. Talk to Cohn Resnick's advisors. From the Interactive Broker Studios, our Bloomberg Business Flash, Lisa Mateo.
And we've got stop slumping worries over the latest escalation in Russia's war against Ukraine. NASDAQ futures, little change, down about 16 points. Dow futures down 0.4%, 198 points. S&P futures down 0.2%, or 13 points. Taking a global look, we have the Stock 600 down about 0.7%. The DAX in Germany down nearly 1%. The CAC in Paris down 1%. The 2-year yield 4.23%. That's down 4 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.37%, and that's down 4 basis points. To currencies, the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little changed. We have the Japanese yen stronger, euro, British pound weaker. Checking with defense stocks, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics are both up nearly 1%. We go now to earnings. Lowe's, they raised its sale forecast for the year. That was thanks to improving housing spend, but shares are down more than 1%. Maybe it just wasn't enough to reassure investors that the home improvement market is back to normal. Shares of Walmart up more than 3%. It raised its guidance for the year, beat third quarter revenue, profit forecast, strong spending from shoppers just looking for bargains. And finally, Finnish sports goods maker Armor Sports. It's the owner of brands like Wilson, Arc'teryx. Third quarter earnings beat estimates. ADR's up 9% now. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom and Paul.
Did they sponsoring the Mateo batting cage?
Oh, Louisville Sluggers. Yes, they do. Louisville
they
Slugger
do?
bat.
Oh, that's very good.
That's still a name.
What is it, 2 in the morning? You got your daughter out there? Swing!
Maybe 1.
1 in the morning. Okay,
Yes.
You bring them in. This is a joy. Last year, my economist of the year was Neil Dutta of Renmac, who on GDP was just amazing, Paul. He was optimistic.
Very
Now
good.
everybody's optimistic, but he was pretty lonely there for
People were
2
talking
years
about
or
that
so.
recession.
This year, I switch over to the interest rate call, and there's lots of good people here that absolutely nailed a higher regime. Mohammed El-Arian, Andrew Hollenhorst, it's Citigroup. I'm going to give major credit to, and maybe none more than Jim Bianco, who was really wonderful early of saying, the disinflation back to 2% game, that may not happen. But in the trenches this year, no one nailed this call like Lindsey Piegza. She's not some academic trotting out a paper, a JSTOR paper every 3 years. She's in the trenches every day saying, maybe not. Joining us, our economist of the year, my economist of the year, Lindsey Piegza, chief economist of Stifel. Lindsey, as I make this announcement, do you still believe in a higher rate regime?
I do. I think it's going to be very difficult for the Fed to continue along this pathway. And I think at this point already reducing the size of rate cuts between September and November, any further surprises in the data, particularly the inflation data, is likely going to warrant a reduced pace of policy action as well, with the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell himself unwilling to rule out the potential for a pause or even a rate hike in the coming year. So I think we're on the verge of a pause. Now, whether that comes December or January, we're seemingly splitting hairs, but the Fed is slowing down with inflation still sticky and the economy still strong.
Is your terminal rate not a John Williams terminal rate? We don't get back to 2.x%. Does Lindsey Piegza, with your higher rate regime, have a rate we're getting back to that is new for America?
I think 375 by the end of next year is a pause point, a comfortable pause point for the Fed. Now, whether or not they give us an additional 25 to 3.5 in 26, that still remains a little squishy and will depend on the incoming data. But in either case, this is noticeably above both the Fed and the market's expectation for that longer-term neutral rate of policy.
When you have a PhD from NYU, squishy has a certain meaning.
Okay, very good. Lindsey, we had some decent results out of Walmart, out of Lowe's, I guess a little bit better than expected maybe, and that kind of ties in with some pretty solid retail sales numbers we saw last week. You put all that together, what's that tell you about the consumer here?
Well, we continue to see ongoing resilience in terms of spending activity. As you mentioned, the gain in retail sales was widespread across a number of categories. We saw electronics jumping the most since April, up over 2%. Vehicle sales rising the most in 3 months. Gains in eating, drinking, building materials, you name it. So it was a pretty solid report, again, underlining this story that we have this persistently resilient consumer perpetuating solid economic conditions as the backbone of the U.S. economy. Now, broadly, we're still feeling the weight of higher prices, higher borrowing costs, as well as the near-term disruptions from hurricanes. But we see these improvements in income, as well as access to other supplemental factors, such as credit cards, which continue to provide welcome support to consumer spending. Now, I don't want to oversell the state of the consumer. We are down from a more robust pace of nearer 4% last year. But at the current trend of 2.5%, this remains sufficient to signal ongoing support to broader economic activity nearer a 3% GDP pace as we look out to the end of the year and beyond into 25.
So with that 3% GDP pace looking forward, does the Fed need to really do anything here?
You know, the decision to cut, I think even in November, begs the question of why. But I think it comes down to, given the simple fact that bypassing November, just 1 month after that outsized increase, or excuse me, that outsized rate cut in September, would have been interpreted as an omission of a policy error. I think at this point, the Fed is simply responding to the fact that they have little option for additional policy easing, even though it was a lesser 25 basis points in November, particularly given that they had the cover needed by that recent hurricane weakness in payrolls. But if they were truly data dependent, I don't think they would have moved into November, and I don't think they would move in December.
Wow. I mean, Lindsey, this is really critical. We were up at the Boston Fed the other day, greeting Susan Collins, Mike McKee, and that one day talking to Susan Collins of Boston and Austin Goolsbee of Chicago. How about Piegza 101? Are we accommodative or restrictive right now?
Well, to be fair, we still are restrictive. And so changing conditions in the current environment do warrant a less firm policy as we slowly move back towards neutral, given that the data continue to normalize. But again, the sense of urgency that the Fed signaled with a 50 basis point cut out of the gate in September sent the wrong signal to the market that this was a Fed in a rush to provide support to an ailing economy and move policy back to an accommodative stance. So the messaging, I think, was extremely inappropriate. And given the strength of the data, I think the Fed needs to realize that the pace now needs to be severely reduced in order to set a more neutral tone.
Paul, squeeze one more in here with my economist of the year. It's like talking to Simon Johnson, you know, winning the Nobel. She's going to Stockholm.
Exactly. So, Lindsey, here, I mean, I think one of the concerns about President Trump's economic policies is that they may be inflationary. Is that a big risk for you when you think about tax cuts and tariffs and so on?
Well, when we look at these in and of themselves, there could be inflationary implications, but that provides us with somewhat of a superficial analysis, or maybe better said, an incomplete analysis, as that doesn't account for, particularly on the tariff side, consumers' ability to adjust what they're purchasing. It also doesn't account for the value that we may be instilling by protecting American industries, domestic job creation, preserving the quality and safety of products and services entering the economy. So it's a broader conversation and analysis that needs to be had, as opposed to just the top-line knee-jerk reaction.
Lindsey, thank you so much. Lindsey Piegza with Stifel, greatly appreciated this morning. We'll get her on again for a more lengthy conversation. Right now, futures negative 16, stasis on stocks off of what's going on in Kyiv and in Moscow. The VIX out to 16.50. With our news in New York City, John Tucker.
And Tom and Paul, Ukrainian forces carrying out their first strike on a border region in Russia using Western supplies missiles as President Vladimir Putin approved an updated nuclear doctrine expanding the conditions for using atomic weapons. Ukraine deployed ATACMS missiles to strike a military facility. It was the first known attack following a decision by President Biden's administration to approve Kyiv's limited use of weapons to hit targets inside Russia. Meanwhile, Putin signed a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack on its soil that threatens its sovereignty. And we're awaiting a word from President Biden at any moment. Donald Trump may be closer to a decision on a Treasury Secretary. Bloomberg News learning the president-elect's team is considering former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh for the role, paired with hedge fund manager Scott Bessent as head of the National Economic Council. And Bloomberg's Jody Schneider reports this decision has been a longer time coming than some of Trump's other cabinet picks.
We had thought this one might come last week, and of course it's only been 2 weeks since the election. Seems like a lot longer, but Treasury is one that we thought we would get in the first round, and these were coming fast and furious last week, and even yesterday, as you know, with the transportation nod. But this one seems to be kind of caught up in some politics and also just personalities.
Bloomberg's Jody Schneider reports Cantor Fitzgerald CEO Howard Lutnick appears to be out of the running after appealing to Trump directly for the Treasury position. A U.S. envoy says an agreement to end the Israel-Hezbollah war is within our grasp after talks in Lebanon today. There was no such optimism in the Gaza Strip. That's where the looting of nearly 100 aid trucks by armed men worsened an already severe food crisis. And the leaders, President-elect Donald Trump's Department of Government Efficiency, have discussed trying to create a mobile app for Americans to file their taxes free with the IRS. This story, according to the Washington Post. Trump last week tapped Elon Musk and former pharmaceutical executive Vivek Ramaswamy to lead the DOGE panel. Global news, 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg.
They're really calling it the DOGE panel?
Sure.
I'm still not. I'm not used to this. Hey, public service announcement. We've got a survey. We need you to go to Bloomberg Podcasts out on YouTube, youtube.com/Bloomberg Podcasts. That's where you can subscribe. youtube.com/Bloomberg Podcasts. Click on the link to our survey. Our partners are material in this. We want you to fill out the survey, and you have been. Thank you. And it's all Lisa Mateo all the time.
Sure, that's what they want.
And they told me to
3 hours of newspaper stories.
Don't get comfortable. Bloomberg Surveillance. Fill out the survey. Good morning.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. We've got futures falling, tensions rising in the Russia-Ukraine war. Traders also monitoring cabinet appointments for the incoming administration as well. So we've got NASDAQ futures down 0.2%, 46 points. Dow futures down 0.5%, 232 points. S&P futures down 0.3%, or 19 points. The two-year yield 4.23%. That's down 4 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.36%, and that's down 5 basis points. Gold gaining up about 1% at $2,638 an ounce. We go over to oil right now. Brent crude down about 0.2%, $73 a barrel. WTI crude $68 a barrel. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little change. We have the Japanese yen stronger, euro, British pound weaker. Bitcoin back in record territory, now above 92,000. A lot of action in digital assets. Trump Media and Technology and talks about digital asset marketplace Backed holdings. Backed is up about 15%, but that was after it jumped more more than 160% yesterday. And also NASDAQ set to launch options on BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF today. Shares of Super Microcomputer still on the rise, are up about 28%. It hired a new auditor, also filed a plan to comply with NASDAQ listing requirements. And finally, shares of Nestle down more than 2% in Switzerland. Investors felt its updated guidance a bit too ambitious. The company also announced plans to separate its bottled water brands into a standalone business. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Lisa Mateo. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Lisa, thanks so much. 2 weeks after the invasion, Tina Fordham, this is in Barron's, was interviewed, and she said, "We are in a new territory." I guess this morning we're in a new territory. Paul and I, Lisa and Michael Barr, we feel strongly we should not be inflammatory. I say markets are well-tempered here now, Paul. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I believe so.
The German yields move in lower yield, more so on a percentage basis than the U.S. yields, but it's somewhat of a tempered response. Joining us now from Fordham Global Insight, Tina Fordham from London on short notice. Tina, honored that you could be with us this morning. The basic idea I hear from fancy people like you is that we shouldn't worry about calling Mr. Putin's bluff, and we should be more constructive, more aggressive in our strategy against Mr. Putin. Do you amend that this morning?
I love the way you put that, Tom. I think that Putin is testing us. That's how I would frame what's going on. And in international relations terms, what we're seeing is signaling Putin by moving forward the nuclear doctrine change that he's been working on since September, following Biden's announcement that Ukraine is allowed to fire missiles, not really long range, or about 50 to 60 kilometers in range, into Ukraine, is an escalation. And, you know, game theorists work on how these scenarios can unfold, but Putin is trying to decrease U.S. willingness to arm Ukraine, and Biden is trying to make it more costly for the incoming Trump administration to change its posture on support for Ukraine. So there's a lot happening in steps.
What I see happening from your comments a week after the invasion is that Finland and Sweden are in NATO. To me, there's no immovable force like that, basically from Helsinki down to Istanbul. Does Putin feel threatened now after 2 years of conflict?
I'm less concerned about how Putin feels, I suppose, except that his strategy has backfired because NATO has expanded. And even if the divisions in Europe that he's trying to inflame, you know, there were already plenty of divisions there to start with, are deepening, what we can see emerging is, an increased commitment from the Baltic NATO member states, Poland, and the Nordics, Finland, Sweden, and the others. And these countries have militaries, and they have been on the wrong side of Russian aggression. So they're serious.
Tina, President-elect Trump on the campaign trail has said that he will move for a very quick resolution to the war here. On the ground in Ukraine with the Russians, what's the likelihood of that?
Well, he said that he would end the war on day one. We actually have set up a tracker of day one policies.
Oh, no. Wait. You have a Fordham Global Insight countdown clock?
We have a tracker of day one policies. It's going to be a long day. It's going to be like when the Lord created the earth in 7 days, a long day. Because it's really hard to imagine how it could all happen. But yes, we do have a tracker, which we're happy to share with our friends at Bloomberg, because the mass deportations are also happening on day one, as is ending the war in Ukraine. It's the terms, of course, of settlement that are at stake here, right? Russia controls 20% of Ukrainian territory now, 1,000 days after the invasion. The terms of the settlement are what's at stake.
Okay, so we go back here, ancient history. Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates, They're quoting Churchill here when you were quoted in Barron's, give us the tools and we will finish the job. That in the Washington Post. When Secretary Rubio gets on the plane to do shuttle diplomacy, what does it look like, Tina Fordham?
It looks like a demilitarized zone, perhaps, in that 20% of Russian-held territory, which, of course, Russia considers Russian territory. Let's not forget. Kyiv wants it to include some security guarantees, reparations, how anyone can force Russia to pay reparations. But you're getting ahead of the game, I think, Tom, if I may say, because markets have had a bit of a wobble today, as we say in the UK. Poland is now a proxy for what happens in the war in Ukraine. Poland has the biggest and deepest capital market, really, in the region, so that's not surprising. It's for Europe, it's about how emboldened Putin is to try this again.
So, okay, so what happens between now and Inauguration Day, and then maybe what happens in the first 100 days after? Do you have any sense of how that might develop?
Well, yes. I mean, we have been cautioning our clients that this is actually a heightened period of geopolitical risk because it's a kind of an interregnum period between Biden and Trump. And if you know that you're going to be kind of forced to sit down at the negotiating table, of course, what you want to do in the intervening period is to enhance your gains, to consolidate them, to increase your leverage in the eventual negotiations. And so Biden, by granting Zelensky the right to use those ATACMS, has given Kyiv a little something to hold on to, but not very much, not enough to change the terms, in my view. But it has given Putin something, which is the encouragement to do more nuclear saber rattling, and that's impacting Germany, let's not forget, because Scholz, elections coming in February, doesn't want to give the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Europe looking very weak, unfortunately.
Tina, thank you so much. On short notice, Tina Fordham with us, Fordham Global Insight. And what surveillance is about, we have Tina Fordham, and coming up in moments, Paul Donovan will join us from UBS. Just a great lineup today. And I should point out, David Gura in Rio. Paul, can I state a changed G20 meeting? Boy,
yeah, exactly, Tom. It's we've talked to David, and David's talked to us about the overhang, if you will, of the Donald Trump incumbency coming in January, and what that means for the G20.
We've got mixed reports. President Biden, Rich, help me here. President Biden may speak. We don't know. There's no set time. Thank you for that. But, we're making jokes with David Gura yesterday about Caparinas in the Copacabana beach. Today's not a joke. Today it just got way more serious.
Way more serious over in Ukraine. So we've had some developments there, and the markets are reacting here with a little bit of caution, Tom.
We'll go to Mr. Gura in Rio here in a moment. Futures, they deteriorate a little bit. Futures at negative 22 right now. The VIX out over a stick, 16.65. We had a 17 level later, so that's a little more quiescent. Paul's going to walk out of the studio, if I don't quote Bitcoin, 92,000.
How about that, kids?
Michael McGlone, is he buying 6,000 or 7,000 square feet in Miami? Exactly. It's as simple as that. Stay with us on YouTube, Bloomberg's Surveillance.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
In the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lise Mateo. We've got red on the screen after news that President Vladimir Putin pushing ahead to allow Russia to expand its use of atomic weapons. Right now, NASDAQ futures down 0.3%, 65 points. Dow futures down 0.5%, 245 points. S&P futures down 0.3%, or 22 points. The two-year yield at 4.22%. That's down 5 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.35%, and that's down 6 basis points. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little change. We have the Japanese yen stronger, euro, British pound weaker, and we have Bitcoin right now up over 92,000. Checking back in with shares of Lowe's, Walmart after earnings. We have Lowe's down 1%, Walmart up about 3%. Companies making news. It's Apple increased its offer to invest in Indonesia. It's part of an order to persuade the government to lift the sales ban that's been on that iPhone 16. Sources say it plans to invest almost $100 million in the country over 2 years. And the Department of Justice pushing Alphabet's Google to sell off its Chrome browser to break up its search monopoly. And more Jersey Mike's shops could be headed to you. Blackstone agreed to buy a majority stake in the chain. The deal could value Jersey Mike's at about $8 billion, including debt. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom and Paul.
Thank you so much. We go to Jersey Mike's expert, Paul Sweeney, on this. Give it a Subway comparison. Is it basically a local Subway, or is it different?
In my opinion, it is a cut above Subway. The stores are much nicer, larger, in my opinion. The meat is cut fresh right in front of you. That's kind of their signature differentiator.
So if John Gray at Blackstone slides in with a family,
yep,
and they go roast beef,
sure,
it's cut right in front of you.
Right in front of you, and they make it right in front of you.
And they put more meat in it. It's stacked. Their sandwiches are stacked.
It's pretty good. Yeah, it's pretty solid. And again, we have great delis here.
I
know. Well, she knows what
she's
talking about.
When have you last eaten meat? Was Nixon president?
Yes, exactly.
All the time. There's a Jersey Mike's in my town, and they're all the time.
Yeah. We'll have team coverage for you here. We're thinking road trip, 33rd Street, East Side. Paul Donovan joins now. He's chief economist at UBS Global Wealth. Paul, I am fascinated by where we are in terms of global recession. I got China struggling. Selected EM is enjoying a devaluation, strong dollar. How close are we to global recession?
I think we're still a pretty long way away, to be honest. This is I would describe it as a fairly benign growth situation right now. Middle income consumers, that critical driver of growth, are in a pretty good place still in both Europe and the States. Unemployment is very low, both sides of the Atlantic. So it's not a situation where I think recession is imminent. Of course, policy could push us there. We could get some kind of accident. But right now, I don't really see it happening.
So, Paul, give us a sense here just of the U.S. economy. Boy, the retail sales number last week was pretty solid. We got pretty good numbers out of Lowe's and Walmart today. Talk to us about the U.S. economy right here. What's your view?
Well, I think basically the U.S. economy is doing a lot better than U.S. consumers think it's doing. It's one of these noticeable trends that if you look at sentiment surveys, and frankly, I don't tend to look at them that much, but if you do look at them, people say, oh, everything's great for me, but it's terrible for the economy at large. And so this gap has really widened up. Actually, again, household income is good. You've seen real disposable incomes rise across the United States over the last few years. Yes, I know grocery bills have gone up, but other prices have come down. And so the overall effect, combined with wage growth, is consumers are still providing a very solid basis of support. It's not tear-away economic growth, but it's a fairly decent level of growth that we're seeing.
So, all right, let's go to your backyard here. Talk to us about just the UK and European economies here. How concerned should we be here in the US about Germany, about France, about the UK?
Well, you've got quite different economies going on here. And one of the very first things we've got to recognize is that Germany and Italy have falling populations. What that means is their headline GDP is automatically at a disadvantage compared to countries like the UK or the US, which primarily as a result of immigration have rising populations. So you've automatically got to adjust when you look at the headline numbers to take account. Germany's got some problems because what has happened is the developed economy consumer has pretty much universally shifted their spending patterns. We now favor having fun over goods. Somebody asked me the other day, what does an economist mean by having fun? And the answer is anything you can post about on Instagram. So that's leisure travel, that's concerts, that's sporting events. It's new clothes too, that's also part of the process. And with that shift, obviously countries like Germany and also China are at a disadvantage because they specialize in exporting goods, whereas countries like Greece, which specialize in exporting fun, are doing very well in that situation. It's a very bifurcated situation.
Paul Donovan fired up. Paul, I got to extend this discussion. Are you telling me Tottenham fans, when they go to Tottenham, they're on north of London, they haven't won since time began. Tottenham fans are having fun when they go watch Tottenham lose?
Well, I suppose it's sort of a certain amount of schadenfreude going on there, that people are delighting in the misery of others. Perhaps.
Yes, okay. Paul, I want to talk here, I think it's so important, about American exceptionalism. When we have a debate over immigration, hugely important in the election, at the margin, can a diminished immigration in America harm our American exceptionalism?
I think there is a risk, absolutely, because you have a number of factors that come in here. Firstly, if the US population stops growing, the trend rate of growth for the United States will be lower. That's just an automatic fact, because your trend rate of growth is the combination of how many workers do you have and how hard are they working? So that's population growth plus productivity growth. And it is, I think, quite unlikely that productivity growth would suddenly leap up to fill the void. The second thing is that by having a sort of a diverse population with different experiences, that is really, really useful when everything in the world is being turned upside down by technological change and innovation and so on and so forth. Because the broader the range of experiences, the broader the background that you have in your workforce and in your decision makers, the more likely it is that you're going to spot unusual opportunities and, which is perhaps more important, the unusual risks that come out of all this technological change. So I think it potentially diminishes some of the arguments around US exceptionalism.
One final question, if I could, Paul. I think it's just too important.
Absolutely.
Folks, there's snow in London.
What?
It's 12 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 11 centigrade, something like that. I'm making it up as I go. And we are talking, you know the movie Babe?
Yep.
Where the dogs are running around with the sheep? Paul Donovan's living this. Paul, what do you do with the sheep on your farm when it's this cold this early in the United Kingdom?
Well, unfortunately, my sheep have not been sheared recently, so they're doing perfectly well. Well, they're looking rather disgruntled, but sheep always look disgruntled. It's just a natural facial expression for them. So they're perfectly happy in the field at the moment.
So it's like heads of research departments. They're always looking disgruntled, right?
Exactly.
Thank you. Nailed that. Paul Donovan, I want us to explain, folks, Paul Donovan of UBS, with his commitment to the company and the heritage of their demographic economics goes back to Jonathan Anderson in China, where they literally, Paul, invented demographic analysis of China.
Yep.
This is 20, 30 years ago as well. Paul Donovan of UBS there. Thank you so much. The VIX 16.84. Paul watching the bond market. The Sweeney yield, Paul, 4.23%. It's deteriorated. It's a lower yield, a higher price.
It's a higher price, lower yield. The 10-year Treasury, Tom, which is so much of the world's paper is priced against. We're off about 7 basis points today, 4.34%. Right. A lot of folks are wondering if we're going to test that 4% level.
German yields, a greater percentage, a lower yield. With our news in New York City, here's John Tucker.
All right, Tom and Paul, we begin with nuclear saber rattling. Russian President Vladimir Putin approving an updated nuclear doctrine. It allows Russia to expand its use of atomic weapons. It comes days after the U.S. gave Ukraine limited permission for long-range missile strikes on Russian territory. We get more from Bloomberg's Roz Matheson.
Russia does view this as an escalation and is now sort of putting that nuclear card on the table. But again, this was a doctrine change that was first talked about some months ago.
Well, Ukraine armed forces have now carried out the first strike with U.S.-designed and manufactured missiles. It comes in a border region with the Russian territory. The Biden administration did give Ukraine limited permission for those long-range missile strikes on Russian territory earlier in the week. President-elect Trump may be getting closer to a decision on the next Treasury Secretary. Bloomberg has learned Trump's team is considering pairing former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh to lead the Treasury with hedge fund manager Scott Bessent as director of the White House National Economic Council. Bessent has been seen as a front-runner for the Treasury role. Let's get more from Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel.
The National Economic Council is still an influential seat, maybe not as influential as the Treasury Secretary. It's currently, that position is taken by Lael Brainard, who was the dove on the Fed, who left the Fed during their aggressive rate hiking cycle to go work more closely with the Biden administration.
Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel reports both Bessent and Warsh are seen as having the Wall Street pedigree that President-elect Trump wants. The U.S. plans to make a huge investment in a new semiconductor research institute. The institute, a total $1 billion investment. It'll be headquartered in North Carolina. The Commerce Department says within 5 years, it will help speed technology development, reduce by 25% greenhouse gases associated with chip manufacturing, and train more than 10,000 students and workers on digital twin technology. A piece of metal fell off the roof at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, before the Cowboys-Texas Monday Night Football game. More debris followed. Another piece of metal appeared to be loose on the rafters. The Cowboys said high winds during the day were a factor. The second piece of metal that was stabilized, the roof was closed so the game could start. And finally, Arthur Fromer, remember him?
Thank you for mentioning that.
He virtually invented low-budget travel with his guidebook, Europe on $5 a Day. He died. He was 95, passed away at his home on the Upper West Side. He built an empire of guidebooks, package tours, hotels, and other services on the bedrock of that first book. That first book was published in 1957, sold millions of copies in annually updated editions until 2007.
Right.
It was Europe from $95 a day in 2007.
I'm so glad you mentioned this. We've been efforting. I'm talking to his people. Charlie Pellet, scheduled to be with us, our Europe on $5 a day correspondent here on what John mentioned there, the excellence of Arthur Fromer. Bloomberg Surveillance, we're brought to you nationwide by Commonwealth, supporting more than 2,000 independent financial advisors with a 2-to-1 advisor to staff ratio, small firm attentiveness, big advisor impact. Go to commonwealth.com to learn about their consultative support in technology. When you're traveling, Paul, you do more than me. Do you use a tour, like an Arthur Fromer thingy?
No, but I used a travel agent for our trip to Ireland several months ago.
They still have travel agents.
Yes, and boy, was it worth the money. They did everything, and it was phenomenal. Because when you want to go tour someplace, where do I go? When do I go? How much time do I spend? I don't know how to do all that stuff.
Yeah, I
and
agree.
the internet didn't do it for us. And so we just literally walked across the street into a travel agency, and boom, done.
They're still out there.
They're still out there.
That.
I don't know.
Very cool.
Yeah, so good for them.
Okay, well, that's where we are. We are here with an eclectic set of guests this morning. Is Jeffrey Yu still with us? I know we had Mr. Yu scheduled. Jeffrey Yu is going to be with us on the correlations of the market. David Gura in Rio to end the show. He didn't want to get up too early.
No,
I mean,
please.
They're
out.
Every report he does, he's missing another article of clothing.
Well, I know. Did you
notice
notice
Rio?
that? I know Lisa mentioned
when
that.
in Rio, you do it like the locals, right?
A good set of lists coming
Lisa
up here.
can't wait till his last report.
Earl Davis, an important voice on fixed income. Earl Davis up in Canada, really always interesting on fixed income, will join us as well. We're on YouTube. Subscribe to Bloomberg Podcast. The poll's out there. Go to YouTube.com, Bloomberg Podcast, and there's a poll. Thank you, Material, for your help on this independent, secret, triple top secret poll. You could say constructive things about John Tucker. From New York City, Bloomberg Surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
The Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. We've got stocks slumping after Ukrainian forces reportedly carried out their first strike on a border region in Russia using Western-supplied missiles. Right now, we have NASDAQ futures down 0.5%, 121 points. Dow futures down 0.7%, 332 points. S&P futures down 0.5% or 34 points. We have the two-year yield at 4.23%, down 5 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.34%, and that's down 7 basis points. To currency, the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little changed. Right now we have the euro weaker, British pound weaker. We have Bitcoin up about 0.1% at around 91,000. Gold gaining, spot gold higher, $2,633 an ounce. We have oil, Brent crude down about 0.2%, $73 a barrel. WTI crude, $68 a barrel. More data on the housing market out this morning. U.S. housing starts declined in October to the slowest pace in 3 months. Hurricanes really impacted those southern regions. New single-family home construction, that fell, but multifamily housing starts increased. Building permits, will those ease? Thursday, it's on to existing home sales. Company making news, it's Novo Nordisk launching its Wegovy obesity drug in China. It's actually at a lower price than in the U.S. According to online listings, a 1-month supply of the starter dose, it'll cost just over $193, and that's compared to the more than $1,300 list price in the U.S. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom and Paul.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Matt Bryson over at Wedbush out with NVIDIA, actually with a lower price target than some, but nevertheless from 140 up to his price target 160. His boss, Mr. Ives, opines here. Paul, I'm going to make this quick here because we got such an important guess. A drop the mic performance from NVIDIA. They're going to look for a beat and then a forward view. We believe 2 billion beat, 2 billion guide higher. That from Wedbush.
Dan Ives has been extremely bullish on NVIDIA, and he's putting it out there here before they report their numbers tomorrow.
We will have to see on that. We'll have full coverage for you, and really look to Carol and Tim to get that done. Yep. Good morning on YouTube. Particularly good morning in Scotland and the United Kingdom.
Love it.
Aberdeen with a roll up there over the last couple years, and joining us right now within the news flow of this missile 150 miles into Russia. Sri Kochigavodian, senior research economist, Aberdeen Investments, joins us right now. Sri, the market reaction to this missile is actually, to me, somewhat muted, but yields are coming in Germany, in England, in America. Do you see what Lagarde talked about the other day, a disinflationary tendency that could unravel to some form of deflation?
I think there's a number of different aspects that we need to really unpick here. So I think the market reaction today is very light on data, and obviously the key focus is on a couple of things. Obviously, what's happening in Russia, Ukraine is driving, in part, has driven the safe haven bid. There was a little bit of a movement in oil earlier today, but it's a little bit muted there. But there's also the main focus really is about the US politics and the cabinet information there and the future policy. I think as far as Europe are concerned, we also had some inflation data out earlier today. And I think what was interesting was that if we look through the headline figure, which went up slightly, it's at 2%, but there was some base effect. And you drill down into the domestically generated inflation, it's still elevated. It has been very sticky, but it's coming down. If we look at services inflation, it's decelerating. So I think so far that disinflation trend is still intact and it's still underway. There are risks to that nonetheless with tariffs potentially, and that's something we can come back to. But for now, it seems that the ECB is still really going to be focusing on that disinflation trend, but also the fact that the economy is looking weaker than it has been. So I think that overall picture there does support further easing from the ECB, and probably at a more aggressive pace than we can expect from the Fed or the Bank of England. So yes, that disinflation trend is still intact for now, and the ECB is still on the easing path.
Shri, we had our election here in the United States 2 weeks ago. Did you change, or to what extent have you changed kind of your economic outlook for 2025, given a new resident in the White House, plus a Republican-controlled Congress.
Yes, I think that's been our real focus over the last few months. We were expecting that any economic outlook would be very conditional upon whether or not you get a clean sweep or a split Congress. And so we now have that clarity. And really what we have to wait for now is to look at that combination of who is picked for the top jobs. Treasury Secretary pick is obviously the big news of today. That's what everybody's waiting for. But I think that overall package that we're expecting is for, it depends on timing, but some of the campaign promises that were made that were a little bit more on the extreme end, perhaps we don't get as far as there. So we need to think about, well, what is deliverable in an easy, meaningful fashion. So it does seem that in terms of tariffs, China is likely to be the biggest sort of hit, the biggest loser there in terms of tariffs. There's already some infrastructure in place. Section 301 was used last time. We can probably see that happening quite soon. So yes, there will be an impact there in terms of growth.
Critically, Sri, and you're so good at this from a distance, do you sense an exuberance in America? We just had the call on NVIDIA, Mag 7. Yep. We got Walmart with a 35 PE. As an economist, do you see an effervescence or exuberance in America that's a little too much?
Well, I think the market is really reacting to the expectations of policy, right? So we have deregulation on the cards, potentially tax cuts. This is quite favorable for equity markets, for that earnings picture. And you're really seeing that in that sectoral reaction in terms of financials or regional banks that are picking up quite nicely. Tech stocks are going to be a beneficiary of this mix of deregulation. Now, also, we don't have the details yet, but I think what the market is pricing in, it's very US focused. It is that stimulus sort of set of policies that are being expected. But we also saw the initial reaction 2 weeks ago was very much for reflation as well. And I think those are some of the risks that we need to be looking out for. We've had that nice disinflation trend globally, but perhaps there could be some slower pace there for inflation in the US and for the Fed to be easing.
Sri, thanks so much. Sri Kovachgodian with Aberdeen Investments today on the broader view of Europe and, of course, what we see. I want to make clear, we're not waiting for President Biden to speak, but there are reports that he will speak today from G20. I'm very unsure on that. I don't have a time. We have a rocket ship at 5 p.m., Starship.
Is it taking off or landing?
It's both.
Okay.
The whole thing is it takes off and then they do, John Tucker said they do the chopsticks thing and it lands. But this time President-elect Trump, I believe, will be there with Mr. Musk. Okay. And some kind of there. Awesome. I don't know if they're tuned in from Mar-a-Lago or they're there, they're not at Cape Kennedy, they're over in Texas. But anyways, it's at 5 p.m. Today. We'll see
Carol
something
and Tim will take care of that.
On that. We got NVIDIA tomorrow, right? I mean, NVIDIA's a Wednesday
after the close,
thing, right?
Yep, after the close, and that'll be, Dan Ives again, as we just called out his tweet, he's looking for a beat and a raise in guidance, pretty substantial. And it's, we always talk about NVIDIA. The bar's held very, very high for them. You take a look at the multiple, but they've always cleared it.
Out on live chat on YouTube. Thank you out on YouTube. Subscribe to Bloomberg Podcast. There's a live chat, and I learn a lot from it. And somebody said, we played Mickey Gilley doing Stand By Me, and somebody said, hey, stupid, play Benny King.
Oh.
And you have to, because he is, he was on the edge of the drifters. This is up in Harlem where they're inventing this.
Yep.
And they basically were all starving. There's no other way to put it. It was a really difficult business. And a guy named Ahmet Erdogan of Atlantic Records said, this guy's different. And he's the one that got Spanish Harlem and Stand By Me going.
Okay.
So much so that Ahmet Erdogan re-signed Benny King years later. This guy never gave up. This guy delivered excellence for decades and decades and decades out of Teaneck, New Jersey.
Another Jersey?
But from Harlem. And, of course, Spanish Harlem was another big hit. I mean, we're doing Stand By Me today.
Why not?
And it's just, it's
this
the
is
mood.
The one I know. This is the version
This is the one you know.
Yeah.
Benny King.
And the moon is the only light we'll see. No, I won't be afraid. Oh, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Stand by me.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney.
I'm sorry, it's a boom economy, and that's what we're adjusting to.
Neither party seems to want to take on deficits at all.
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
Stocks are coming off of another record high.
And Michael Barr with news. Tensions over Israel's war with Hamas continue to grow. The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Markets on the move. Tom Keene, Paul Sweeney, Michael Barr on assignment with the Detroit Lions, and Lisa Mateo with us. Lisa will have a full data check here in a moment. Moments ago, we saw markets move. 20 minutes ago, I should say. We are now at two big figures on the VIX, 17.79. Yields come in. The 10-year real yield could break through 2%. We're at 2.01 right now, and yields move higher. Two-year yield was a negative 4 basis points, now negative 6 basis points, a lower yield. The headlines are Lavrov speaking here, and of course this is off the missile from Ukraine, 150 miles into Russia. Lavrov, I hope West will study Russian nuclear doctrine. So there we are, and we'll have much more on this. Jeffrey Yu with us in moments. David Gura in Rio coming up. Bloomberg Surveillance this morning, we're brought to you by Commonwealth. We thank Commonwealth for their support. Commonwealth join over 2,000 independent financial advisors. They are taking control of their growth with advisor-centric support and future-ready technologies. Grow on your own terms with a partner dedicated to your success. Go to commonwealth.com to learn how. Dow futures over negative 500 from the Interactive Broker Studios. Our Bloomberg Business Flash, Lisa Mateo.
You're right, stocks really taking a hit, and this is over the latest escalation, Russia's war against Ukraine. Words from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. We have NASDAQ futures down more than 1%, 229 points. Dow futures down more than 1%, 536 points. S&P futures tanking down 1%, 60 points. We have the two-year yield, 4.23%, down 5 basis points. The yield on the 10-year, 4.34%, down 7 basis points. Taking a global look, the stock 600 down nearly 1.5%. The DAX in Germany down nearly 2%. Same for the CAC in Paris. We head over to currencies. The dollar spot right now is little change. We have the euro down 0.2%. The British pound down 0.3%. Bitcoin right now around 91,000. Want to check in with defense stocks? Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics down about 1%. To earnings we go. Lowe's raised its sales forecast for the year. Comparable sales, though, fell in the third quarter. Shoppers put off those big home projects. That's why those shares are lower this morning. They're down about 1%. They're up about 1%. Shares of Walmart, they're up this morning. It raised its guidance for the year, beat third quarter revenue profit forecast. Strong spending. shoppers looking for bargains. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom and Paul.
Lisa, thanks so much. And again, Lisa just gave us this. Strike in Bryansk is a signal that the U.S. wants escalation, that according to Sergei Lavrov. This is in Brazil, where our David Gurry is.
Yeah, we're going to hear from David, Tom, towards the end of this hour. We'll get the frontline reporting from David.
So we were negative 200-ish on the Dow. We're negative 500. A little bit of a recovery here in the last couple of minutes. We'll continue to give you the data. Even Bitcoin pulls back 92,000 to 91,000. Perfect timing to speak with Jeffrey Yu. We're thrilled that he could join us today with BNY, their senior strategist. Jeff Yu, the correlations here in the market, are they across asset classes or is there a nuance to it?
Hi. So I do think there is a nuance to it, and FX markets and other quote unquote alternative asset classes when it comes to havens. I think it'll be interesting to see how they match. We saw the move in the Swiss franc, for example, and that already is a expectations of a flip in correlations, right? So the franc had been undermined by easing, and they'll continue to ease from the S&B side. But when the market goes into geopolitical mode, into defensive mode, then those correlations change as well. The same cannot be said of gold. The same cannot be said of other assets as well. Right. Now, the dollar, I think people differentiate between the dollar and treasuries and liquidity. So even for the same currency denominated market, there will be differences as well.
And Paul, moments ago, Biden official, United States not surprised by Russia nuclear announcement. Paul?
Okay, very good, Tom. I'm just looking at the dollar index, stronger today. Jeffrey, just give us a sense. You're in the UK. Give us a sense, and when you talk to your clients over there in Europe, what's the feeling in the last, 24, 48 hours about Ukraine, geopolitical risk broadly defined here?
Well, I think there are several strands here. One is the short term. So escalation has already been, or the fear of escalation, that's already been reflected into asset pricing. So we've seen the move in bunds, a very large move in the long end. We've seen the move in the Swiss franc, for example. So people being defensive as well. But if you extend until January the 20th and beyond, there may be a new settlement in play. That has been talked about too. So while you are adding to short-term insurance positions, is there a case for a reduction in risk premium as well? So it's not only you have to manage your asset allocation, you have to manage your time frames very carefully. And this is where I'm observing changes in the options market in FX, for example. I think they can tell you different stories.
Another headline, I'm going to say from Rio, but it may be from Washington, a Biden official, more of same irresponsible Russian rhetoric. Jeffrey, you are investors in finance and investment. They have to dovetail U.S., Russian, whatever rhetoric into their investment horizon. Do you do that, or do you ignore geopolitics?
You can never ignore geopolitics. So it's your fiduciary responsibility to have those fundamental allocations, that premium within your asset allocation, full stop. So that I think is the case in terms of why, despite the lack of a fiscal argument in the US, we still see international investors being overweight US treasuries, or at least if I look at duration, the 10-year plus, based on our custodial data, there hasn't been that much selling over the last few weeks or so. And this is another reason why you want to hold on to those treasuries for now. It helps with the US sustain its fiscal spending, but over the medium to longer term, there's a story there. But you want to be overweight near these assets, even though it doesn't give you a strong yield, or you worry about other forms of premium as well. But then we fall back to diversification again. You want to be diversified. You look at your portfolio, your overweight dollars, overweight treasuries. Where are markets that you can afford to add to your weightings that are decorrelated? India is a very good example, and those are the other correlations we're looking at too.
VIX out to 17.56, two figures. Dow negative 550, now negative 450. Standard & Poor's futures at negative 48, down 0.8%. Paul?
Jeffrey, we had an election here in the U.S. 2 weeks ago. How did that change your view, or how you're kind of the message you're getting to your clients?
I don't think it's changed things too much because if we look at the trade side of things, from Beijing's point of view, for example, I think the underlying expectation has been over the last few years, deglobalization, that appears to be a theme. We need to look at, how tariffs progress in any case. If you look at how the dollar has been performing due to the fiscal stances of the candidates, there hasn't been too much differentiation either. Bottom line is U.S. exceptionalism. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. People still want to own that.
Jeff, within the mix of all this, and I know you've got everybody else does a 300-page year ahead look. Jeff does 6 pages. It's great. And Jeff, in that, I look at foreign exchange as a litmus paper. The president-elect clearly wants a weak dollar. You've talked about 105 and even through parity. Is the big surprise 12 months out that we get a shockingly strong, resilient dollar?
So that would be a surprise from those talking about medium to longer term valuations. But you may be surprised to hear this as well, Tom. So for the first time, there may be a path out for, believe it or not, a stronger euro or a reflationary Europe.
Where do you see that?
I'm afraid
you got 1 minute. Go.
Let's see what the German election outcome entails. And also, I put China and Germany within the same boat here. This is an opportunity for them to totally reorient their economies away from exports and towards domestic investment, productivity, and consumption. Both Germany and China can afford to do that. If you're worried about trade, then change the growth model towards domestic consumption. And it feels like, judging by bund flows, even before the recent news on the geopolitical side, some are getting that message. So let's see the next German government and stimulus next March, whether they can turn things around. Early days, but something to watch.
Jeff, get in the studio next time you're in New York. Paul Sweeney demands it. Jeff, are you there with BNY? Brilliant there on a path forward off the German elections. The headlines coming fast and furious from Rio. David Gura to be with us. U.S. indicates it won't respond to a Russian nuclear doctrine move. With an update, our news from New York City is John Tucker.
And Tom and Paul, Ukrainian forces did carry out their first strike on a border region in Russia. They used Western-supplied missiles. This is the first known attack following the decision by President Biden's administration to approve Kyiv's limited use of the weapons to hit targets inside Russia. This attack comes as Russian President Putin today approved an updated nuclear doctrine that allows Russia to expand its use of atomic weapons. More on that end of the story in this report from Bloomberg's Courtney Donahoe.
It comes days after the U.S. gave Ukraine limited permission for long-range missile strikes on Russian territory. Putin signed a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to a massive conventional attack on its soil, including drones. The Russian leader has warned the U.S. and its European allies against allowing Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia using Western long-range, high-precision weapons, saying this would bring them into direct conflict with his country. Courtney Donahoe, Bloomberg Radio.
Well, sources say President-elect Donald Trump's transition team is considering pairing Kevin Warsh, the former Federal Reserve official, in the Treasury Secretary role with the hedge fund manager Scott Bessent as director of the White House National Economic Council. Both Warsh and Bessent are seen as having the Wall Street pedigree that Donald Trump has been seeking to lead his economic team, and each does have the support of a lot of advisors close to the president-elect. One of Joe Biden's main Middle East envoys landed in Beirut this morning as the U.S. steps up efforts to clinch a ceasefire between Lebanese militant group Hezbollah and Israel. Amos Hochstein, who handles Israel-Hezbollah affairs for the White House, will discuss a U.S.-drafted proposal to end the war between the two sides. And SpaceX, slated to launch its gargantuan Starship rocket later today out of South Texas. A key test. It's expected to include a guest visit from the president-elect. One of the most anticipated moments is going to come about 7 minutes into the mission when the company will attempt to catch the Super Heavy booster in midair with those giant mechanical arms that would be repeating the groundbreaking feat from the previous flight mission. Global news, 24 hours a day, whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker. This is Bloomberg. Paul, Tom, Lisa.
And then Tucker, rebound here in the markets off the shock of an hour ago. Comments from Mr. Lavrov in Rio. We went negative 550, Dow negative 422. The SPX comes back, but still down 0.7%, negative 44 in futures. Paul, you're watching the dollar dynamics as well.
Yeah, exactly, Tom. The DXY index higher again earlier in the day, now flat on the day. So again, some of the U.S. rhetoric is just crossing the tape. The U.S. indicates it won't respond to Russian nuclear doctrine move. So that's a little bit of de-escalatory language coming out, which the markets are reacting here. Tom, as you mentioned, the indices, the futures off their lows.
We'll have to see. More of the same irresponsible Russian rhetoric. That from a Biden official. And thank you to Tina Fordham for perspective this morning. We're going to go to David. What do you have?
And Tom, the VIX, I want to call that because I know you make sure that we focus on that. We were up towards 18 just a few minutes ago. We're now below 17 on the VIX.
That's probably Ives buying NVIDIA.
That's right.
I figure he's in there. NVIDIA is a Dow component now, right?
I think so.
I think it's very techy.
Yeah.
Along with Sherwin-Williams is driving the market.
That was added. Paint
this morning. Please stay with us. We're on YouTube. Do your commute on Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and Good Morning 92.9 FM Boston. Then go to YouTube, subscribe to Bloomberg Podcasts. Good morning.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And this futures report sponsored by IBKR. Markets never sleep, and neither does Interactive Brokers. Discover opportunities with CME Group futures across equity indices, interest rates, FX, energy, and more. Access CME futures around the clock at Interactive Brokers. All right, we've still got futures deteriorating. Russia's foreign minister says Ukraine's use of ATACMS a signal of escalation. We have NASDAQ futures down 0.7%, 145 points. Dow futures down about 1%, 434 points. S&P futures down 0.7%, or 44 points. The two-year yield at 4.24%. That's down 3 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.36%, and that's down 5 basis points. Gold gaining, spot gold higher at $2,628 an ounce. Oil, little change. We have Brent crude at $73 a barrel, WTI crude at $68 a barrel. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little change. We have the Japanese yen stronger at 153.94 against the dollar. Euro, British pound weaker, and we have Bitcoin up about 0.5%, about 91,000. A lot of action in digital assets. Trump Media and Technology and talks to buy digital asset marketplace backed holdings, backed up 6%, but yesterday it jumped up more than 160%. And shares of server maker Super Microcomputer, they're still on the rise, are up about 25%. Hired a new auditor, filed a plan to comply with NASDAQ listing requirements. Shares of Nestle down more than 2%. In Switzerland, investors felt its updated guidance was a little bit too ambitious. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Lisa Mateo. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom and Paul.
Lisa, thanks so much. The president-elect at UFC 309 the other day with Triple H. I mean, I guess hugs and kisses were, it was a wrestling match.
Saw that.
The next wrestling match, you saw that? Did you actually see it?
I did not see it. Lisa did it, but I don't do wrestling or whatever it was.
It was a hug and kiss with Triple H. You may have the same thing in the cash room of the United States Treasury. You go in by the statue, and it's a shockingly elegant late 19th century room where for a short time they used gold and cash and all that. It's called the cash room. Saleha Mohsen knows it cold. Of course, Paper Soldiers, her award-winning book, and she joins us now. Her work with Anne-Marie Horton, among others, on this Treasury Secretary mess. Saleha, if there was a wrestling match at Treasury right now for Treasury Secretary, who would the president like to win?
Oh, Tom Keene, that's an absolutely unfair question to ask. I don't know who Trump would want to win. So far, it looks like he just wants the match to keep continuing, and maybe he's going to throw in some additional fighters because it used to be between Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick, and now it seems like it's between Scott Bessent, Kevin Warsh, and maybe Mark Rowan.
Okay, but you didn't mention Lawrence Fink of a small BlackRock claim. You know, he's been talked about as a secretary, as is James Dimon of J.P. Morgan for years. The president wants the wrestling match to continue, but Mr. Musk is involved. They're going to do touchy-feely space flights this afternoon at 5 p.m. Is Mr. Musk intruding on the normal cabinet selection process?
As of Saturday, Musk's tweet was a surprise to a lot of people, including myself, that he weighed into the debate of economic policy and personnel, talking about the importance of sanctions and who the Treasury Secretary should be. When you're inside an administration or incoming administration, you're going to be near the White House, in the proximity to the president-elect. Most people allow the president, who was voted in democratically by winning the popular vote, the electoral vote, and having that mandate to be able to speak on these things. And we saw Elon Musk maybe testing the limits of his new friendship with Donald Trump by weighing into that.
Saleha, what's the feeling within, I guess, Washington, D.C. about what role the Senate will play on approving some of these appointees, particularly some of the ones that have been flagged as kind of questionable? Yeah, traditionally, no matter how contentious things are between parties and within parties, the Senate does tend to defer to a president's Treasury Secretary and Secretary of State picks and some other very top cabinet positions. There's vetting, of course. There's grilling. Everyone goes through a confirmation hearing. But there is now some concern. Can Matt Gaetz get confirmed for Attorney General? That's one key one. There's some other concerning picks, particularly for the Pentagon with Hegseth. We haven't heard a lot from John Thune on that matter. He did say publicly that the president should get to choose his picks. We don't know what that means for the Senate confirmation
Chapter
process.
15 of your wonderful paper Soldiers, Mnuchin, the oligarch, and Jack Lew's nightmare. Come on, I need a second edition, Saleha, right now. Get me out to Chapter 17 and Chapter 18. How badly does this president-elect want a weak dollar, and is he going to demand a weak dollar from Treasury?
I think that there's been a lot of lessons learned from Trump 1.0, where, I think the president has understood. He understands markets to a certain extent, and he understands that tariffs could have an effect of driving the dollar up. And if he wants a weak foreign exchange rate, those are dueling forces that are hard to contend with. So I don't know if he would necessarily try to aggressively force the dollar down, because the U.S. just does not have that ability in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, when you're talking tens of billions versus trillions of dollars traded every day in the currency market. But he could, still talk to other nations and say, well, stop pushing your currency down against the dollar, or just raise it against the dollar.
Saleha, is there any consensus forming as to, within Washington, D.C., what this new administration would like to really get done in that first 100 days, which are so important for every new administration?
Yeah, Paul, we're laser focused on what could happen in the first 100 days. It's always a very important landmark moment in any new administration. This president is going to come in with total power for the Republican Party in Washington, having held on to the House and flipped the Senate in Republican favor. I would expect tax policy to be key on that agenda. The 2017 tax cuts, some of them expire next year. And this is a great moment for Trump and his economic policy team to extend some of those tax cuts while Republicans have their finger on all of Congress.
One more question. Lawrence Fink, BlackRock. Saleha, what do you and Anne-Marie report on this? Is he speaking to the president-elect? Is he speaking to his political team?
I have no reporting on Larry Fink. I wish I did. If you have something, I'd love for you to share it.
Well, Lisa Mateo may. We'll have to see. Saleha, do you have movie rights yet for Paper Soldiers? Come on.
I don't. You are welcome to play me, though.
Well,
No, I think we can do better than that.
We can do better than that. Saleha Mosin, thank you so much. Paper Soldiers, folks, literally a page turner on the weaponization of the U.S. dollar. And Paul, if we get a Jeff Yu currency, I mean, and so Jordan Rochester talking about this at Mizuho, I mean, the president-elect's going to go mental over a strong dollar.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, that's what a lot of folks were saying. Part of the Trump trade, Tom, was, buy the U.S. dollar. So that was the trade.
Well, we'll have to see. We got things have settled down a little bit. We got the VIX up near 18, 17.04. Now we got the Dow in. My eyes are fading here. Negative 400.
Yeah.
We're negative 550. So off of the Lavrov announcements, our date calendar for the next 30 minutes is we're going to talk to a really exquisite guy on coupon and fixed income. Earl Davis is going to be with us, BMO Asset Management. And then, do we have a Gura sighting? Are we getting Gura, or seriously?
There might be a beach camera angle thing.
Well, I don't know. We're going to get Gura, or is he in a meeting? We're going to get him.
Okay.
Our people have talked to his
people. Very good. That's how it works. But he's down there in Rio.
And really active this morning. I mean, there's a lot going on. Possibly the president to speak. We don't have reporting on that yet as well. Gold up $14, 26.29. It's finally got a bid. It's been,
but it's had such a great run here, and it's just been amazing. And you think about the folks that have been telling us to buy gold, buy gold, buy gold. Boy, have they been right. Bitcoin pretty much unchanged on the day, but still 91,000 and change. Tom, give you that quote because I know you're.
I'm going to look at Walmart right now. I mean, Walmart. This seems like ancient history.
Equity Go on your Bloomberg terminal.
Thank you.
Some solid numbers.
It's up $2, 84 up to 86, and huge numbers. It was up a little more earlier as well. We're out on YouTube. There's a poll out there. Go to youtube.com, Bloomberg Podcasts, and from material, there's a private poll. I don't see it. Paul doesn't see it. Lisa demands to see everyone, but we don't. But seriously, it's a really serious poll. We want to know what you want in the future of Bloomberg Radio. On YouTube, subscribe to Bloomberg Podcast, growing each and every day from New York. Bloomberg Surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And this opening bell report is brought to you by JP Asset Management. Stay informed on today's fastest growing investment vehicle with a new guide to ETFs. Visit jpmorgan.com/ETF insights to learn more. All right, how are these markets going to react? We have so much going on this morning. Tensions rising in the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia's foreign minister says Ukraine's use of ATACMS a signal of escalation. Futures have really been pointing to a lower open all morning. Let's see how things kick off in Tuesday trading. Starting with the S&P 500, down 0.5%, 31 points at 5,862. The Dow down 0.6%, 294 points, 43,104. The Nasdaq down 0.4%, 90 points at 18,699. The 2-year yield at 4.25%. That's down 2 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.37%, and that's down 4 basis points. To commodities, we have Brent crude $73 a barrel, WTI crude $69 a barrel, and we have spot gold higher at $2,629 an ounce. To Currencies, the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index, little change. We have Japanese yen stronger at 154.03 against the dollar. Euro, British pound weaker, and right now Bitcoin up about 0.1% at around 91,000. At the open, we're checking in with Lowe's and Walmart after their earnings. We have Lowe's down 2%, Walmart up 3%. That is your Bloomberg Opening Bell report. Tom and Paul.
Lisa, thanks so much. Markets do better than they were 45 minutes ago after the shock of the Rio headlines. David Gurda joined us in 15 minutes. The Dow negative 300. We're negative 550 on futures. Futures are negative 32. Excuse me. The VIX 17.03. I announced this morning my Economist of the Year, and Lindsey Piegza, who absolutely nailed the Fed dynamic of saying, look, they're not going to cut rates as fast as they thought. There were other people there as well. Bringing that over to yield, Paul, there was a lonely voice with the best Montreal Canadian tickets in the nation at Bank of Montreal Asset Management. Earl Davis has been on a stool screaming for 2 years. It's just not going to get back to a lower rate regime. Earl Davis joins us this morning, head of fixed income and money markets at BMO Asset Management. Earl, do you reconfirm that it will be higher for longer in the yield space?
100%. And an interesting thing that backs that up, we've overlaid charts of the inflation regime starting in 2020 to presently, with the inflation regime from the 60s, mid 60s till let's call it 1980. And we are almost on par with the alignment of peak inflation, lower inflation. So it's our expectation that we will test a much higher inflation again, which says, yes, higher yields for longer.
How can we get there like Paul Volcker, 10%, 12%, 14%? Recession is 73, 74, which I lived. I mean, Earl Davis, are you talking about that kind of a volatile regime?
Now, maybe not that high, just because remember the first peak was roughly, call it 8-9%. Can we test that again? It's not a 2025 story, but it's possibly a 2026, 2027 story. The reason why is we have I won't call it zero, but very low slack in the economy or excess supply. So when you start bringing in US-centric policies that are pro-growth and have the potential to increase potential GDP with minimal slack in the economy, that's exactly the kind of tinder that could light up and cause inflation to come again. Remember, it's not a 2025 story, but all the elements are there for the next 2 to 5 years.
So what does that mean, Earl, for the Federal Reserve, who has, cut rates twice? The expectation is they will continue cutting several more times. Do you think that might be on hold?
I think it's as Powell said in regards to there's no rush to do it. So I wouldn't say it might be on hold, but in regards to the euphoria and getting back to 3% overnight rates, I think that has been tempered a bit. But I do see slightly lower rates ahead. And the reason why I see that ahead is because the Fed is not implementing policy for 2 years hence, even though they do say there's an 18-month lag. What they're doing, they're reactive to the data. And the data does show some general slowing, but we're still doing very well.
We had an election, and we've got a new administration and a new Congress to be seated. Did that change your economic outlook or just kind of your view of these markets and perhaps how much risk you want to take?
Yeah, you know what? What it does, it reinforces the uncertainty. So let me back up for a bit. The questions you've been asking me in regards to inflation, I'm saying it's 2025 versus not 2026 and beyond, not 2025. This points to why active management is very important. And it's important because we're going to have volatility. And as an active manager, there's the ability to monetize this volatility. So coming back to the policy change that's coming about, yes, that does increase the volatility, but this is when you want to go into active management. And we've proven that, as was brought up, the past 2 years have been bang on years for us. Like last year, 2023, we had a great active management year, and this year even better. We expect that environment to continue for two reasons. One is the pro-growth centric policies, but the other reason is the absolute level of yields, let's call it 4 to 5%, says you get more basis point movement during the day. So it's a very exciting market to be an active manager in fixed income.
Can you be so bold to say it's a total return market? Or are you getting out the Montreal Canadiens scissors and clipping the coupon?
It is 100% a total return market, and that's how we always look at it. And that's why we still like credit. Even though valuations and credit spreads are tight, your all-in yield is good. And we don't foresee a recession coming, definitely not in 2025, which says, you know what, you could stay invested in risk assets.
I'm looking at my INGO function, the Bloomberg Index browser, and fixed income returns are positive for 2024. What a surprise that is. But U.S. corporate high yield, by far the best performer at almost 8% total return here. Talk to us about high yield.
Yeah, you know what? We like high yield, but the valuations are tight.
Yep.
So it's our expectation that we will get volatility between now and January 1st. We're going to use that volatility. You're seeing a little negativity in the stock market, which reflects itself in credit spreads as well. We're going to use that to switch from our IG, investment grade corporate exposure, to high yield.
No, continue, Earl.
Yeah. So we're going to use that to switch to high yield because your all-in spreads look good. We like the fiscal, let's say the economic position of the U.S., and that is supportive of lower default rates. So we think there's opportunity to do there, but you have to be selective.
Earl, my chart of the year is not equities. It's not this, it's not that, it's bonds. I look at the Bloomberg Total Corporate Index. It was negative 6 standard deviations off trend. You lived that crater. We came back 2.x standard deviations. Do you visualize somewhere out there, our listeners, our viewers on YouTube, they get back to price up, back to that long-term trend?
Yes, and you know what? What's interesting about the returns you've seen both in regular fixed income, let's call it government bonds, as well as you just spoken about investment grade, it's outperformed cash. Everyone says, oh, cash is great at 5% before the Fed started easing. Even now at 4.5 to 4.75, all bond returns have outperformed them. We expect bond returns to continue to outperform cash going forward. But it's hard for people to see that when you see an inverted yield curve because they're just saying cash is great, but it's just a coupon. Remember, when you invest in bonds, you get that coupon, plus you get capital gains as well, too. We think we're in a similar environment where that total return, as we referred to before, will continue to outperform cash. So we're telling our clients, as you have GICs and long-term investment certificate or shorter-term investment certificates maturing, this is the time to both extend duration and to look for credit.
Earl, thank you. What a clinic. Earl Davis, thank you so much with BMO Asset Management. He's just been dead on about a constructive view on the bond market. I don't think, Paul, many people understand when I say bonds up, like over 12 or 14 months, they're like, no, it's all doom and gloom.
No.
But the answer is no. It's been very constructive.
There's been some positive returns here in the bond market, in addition to clipping those coupons. And again, the high yield market, boy, that's been on fire.
We're having a raging debate here. We got a serious conversation coming up with David Gurl. Should he do this with sunglasses or without?
I'd go with sunglasses, but he's a pretty buttoned-up guy. I don't know about that.
I don't know. It's more like Clooney. He sent me a photo last night.
I know.
He's out way too late.
Below the waist is just a Speedo on.
Great.
We just get the top
shot.
No.
David's going to Vilebrequin. He's got the French Saint-Tropez thing going.
Okay.
He and Lola. We're going to go to David Gurr, a serious conversation. Mr. Lavrov changing the discussion in Rio this morning. Running green in the screen, a little better tape over the last hour. With our news in New York City, John Tucker.
All right, Tom, Paul, Lisa, Ukrainian forces did carry out the first strike on a border region in Russia using Western-supplied missiles as President Putin approved an updated nuclear doctrine expanding the conditions for using atomic weapons. Ukraine deployed the missiles to strike a military facility inside Russia, the first known attack following the decision by President Biden's administration to approve Kyiv's limited use of the weapons to hit targets inside Russia. Meanwhile, Putin signed a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack on its soil that threatens its sovereignty. Well, the U.S. indicated that it won't respond to Russia's nuclear doctrine move, with an NSC spokesperson saying that Moscow had been signaling the update for weeks and that the Biden administration was not surprised. Well, Donald Trump may be closer to a decision on a Treasury Secretary. Bloomberg News learning that the president-elect's team is considering former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh for the role, paired with hedge fund manager Scott Bessent as head of the National Economic Council. And John Lieber, Eurasia Group managing director, says there's been infighting over the selection process.
There seems to be concern among a lot of people in the Trump camp that all of the Treasury people who are being considered who have Wall Street ties are just not MAGA enough and don't seem to, in particular, have enough support for Trump's tariff policies, which is, of course, reasonable if your concern is overall U.S. economic growth. And that, I think, is what's delaying here.
Cantor Fitzgerald CEO Howard Lutnick appears to be out of the running after appealing to Trump directly for the Treasury position. The U.S. envoy says an agreement to end the Israel-Hezbollah war is within our grasp. After talks in Lebanon today, there's no such optimism in the Gaza Strip, though. That's where the looting of nearly 100 aid trucks by armed men worsened an already severe food crisis there. And the leaders of President-elect Donald Trump's Department of Government Efficiency have discussed trying to create a mobile app for Americans to file their taxes free with the IRS. This, according to the Washington Post. Trump last week tapped billionaire Elon Musk and former pharmaceutical executive Vivek Ramaswamy to lead the DOGE panel. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Tom.
Moments ago out on Twitter, Bloomberg TV with 1 minute and 40 seconds of Mr. Lavrov in Rio. Look for that out on Twitter under Bloomberg TV. Sergei Lavrov, their foreign minister, making comments. Took a while to get the video up, and we've got it up now for all to see. That out on X, out on Twitter as well. Paul, I'm going to say an improving tape. I mean, even dollar weaker here a little bit.
Yeah, exactly right, Tom. Got the DXY index a little bit negative, but we were futures on the Dow, just for example, we're down more than 550 points. We're now down 350.
The discussion, it's sort of scary. I mean, I don't know what to say.
No, I don't know. You think about that part of the world, we haven't had to think about it for such a long time, but then when Russia invaded Ukraine, boy, all the Cold War kind of theories kind of came back into discussion points here for a lot of people, and it's another data point for the markets to try to digest.
And again, the David Gura in Rio, we'll do that here in a minute or two. On DXY, flat. Yen 154.08. Thank you, Jeff, for perspective. A 105 handle on euro 105.87, but certainly not breaking down to a 104 today. Peso 20.25. I haven't quoted Mexican peso in a while. Somehow I think we're going to be doing that more often into 2025. All in all, we're out on YouTube. Subscribe to Bloomberg Podcast after your commute. In your living room, in your office, YouTube podcast, the best way to see Lisa Mateo and John Tucker. From New York City, Bloomberg Surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And this news just in, Donald Trump's November 26th sentencing in his New York hush money case, well, that was adjourned by the court. The judge weighs how to handle the case in the wake of the election. We'll have more on this in just a bit. Right now, let's head to the markets. Stocks really taking a hit in this after Ukraine carries out its first strike on a border region in Russia with U.S. missiles in Russia. Now, that's fueling rush to bonds and gold as well. Let's start with stocks. We'll get to the NASDAQ. Down 0.1%, 34 points. The Dow down 0.7%, 310 points. The S&P 500 down 0.3%, or 23 points. We'll head over to commodities. We'll start with gold. Spot gold higher at $2,630 an ounce. As far as oil, Brent crude right now up 0.5%, $73 a barrel. WTI crude $69 a barrel. Now we take you to the bond market. The 2-year yield 4.25%. That's down 2 basis points. The yield on the 10-year 4.37%, and that's down about 3 basis points. Defense stocks checking with Lockheed Martin right now. Their shares up nearly 1%, and shares of server maker Super Microcomputer, well, they're up 22%, and that's after it hired a new auditor, hopes it'll avoid a delisting with NASDAQ as well. That is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom and Paul.
Lisa, thanks so much. Greatly appreciate it. Yesterday was a different tone. Lots of chat and giggles on Copacabana Beach, and we played Barry Manilow. Today's serious. There was an event at the G20 meetings in Brazil. President Lula launches the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. 82 countries have already joined, except no one cares. Things have changed in Rio. Joining us now, David Gura, with reporting over the last 15 hours here on Ukraine. David, how have the G20 meetings changed?
Well, there was this attack using long-range weapons that were built in the United States on Russia, on Russian soil by the Ukrainians. The Russians have said that happened. The Ukrainians haven't confirmed it, but that marks a major escalation in this war. And there was just an astonishing split screen a few minutes ago where you had Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, speaking to reporters and addressing that, saying effectively the U.S. wants escalation by doing this, by supplying those weapons and authorizing the use of them. On the other side of the screen, you had President Biden going about business as usual. He wasn't talking about hunger this time. He was talking about climate, but he didn't address what had happened overnight. And so there is a feeling here of what's going to happen next. How does this resolve itself? And Sergei Lavrov in those comments, Tom, saying that the West would do well to study closely the new nuclear doctrine that Russia released in the early morning hours here. And that's stipulating that if Russia is attacked by a non-nuclear power in concert with a nuclear power, Russia would see that as an act of aggression and could retaliate with a nuclear weapon in kind.
David, Germany meeting with China, and at the same time from the Department of Defense, the Secretary, General Austin, marks deepening U.S.-Philippine ties during visit to Manila. Is the United States extended on too many fronts?
The United States is just in a very tricky position right now. I look down at the Atlantic Avenue here in front of me, and I see a string of Chinese flags outside the hotel where that meeting with Chancellor Scholz is taking place. China operating very much business as usual here, really relishing the fact that it's a symbol of stability at this summit. President Xi has been in place for a long time. He's not going anywhere. He's a stalwart, and I think these other countries appreciate that. You know, the U.S., as I say, is in a very tricky position here. It's at a point where leadership is about to change, and there can be all kinds of happy talk from President Biden about multilateralism and the work that he's done over the last 4 years and the groundwork that he's laid for that to continue. But come January, of course, all of that could be scuttled and changed. So I think there's a level of overextension here. Of course, the United States is a global superpower with its eye on all corners of the world. But there just is this moment we're at right now, Tom, where things are about to change so fundamentally. I think that puts it in a very difficult position, to say the least.
David, is there any kind of consensus there at the G20 about how this war in Ukraine should play out over the next 12 months or so? Is there a feeling for peace? Is there a feeling that Ukraine should hold out? Is there any kind of consensus building there?
There's a complete lack of consensus, and it's a very good point to bring up, because what's supposed to come out of this meeting is a communique, and we got that yesterday. That's a statement, a joint agreement from all of the leaders who are gathered here, and I should stress, not all of them are allies. I mentioned Sergei Lavrov of Russia is here. He's in a very strange position among this group of world leaders. But there was poised to be a very kind of difficult debate among leaders about how much to address the conflict in Ukraine in that statement. And President Lula of Brazil, in that moment, as the chair of the G20, the president of the G20, decided to move on and not allow the countries to kind of quibble over what language they would use to describe that conflict and who's responsible and what should happen going forward. So I think what we're seeing here in this microcosm is the level of disagreement about how this war is going, how it's likely to end. We have been reporting on the fact that there are a number of allies here who see the only course of this ending is by some sort of negotiated settlement. So there is more of a push toward that. But no widespread agreement here from those who are gathered here in Brazil.
We're with David Gura in Rio at the G20 meetings. We welcome all of you on your commute across the nation. Good morning, 99.1 FM Washington, Bloomberg 1130 in New York, and 92.9 FM in Boston. And after your commute, we welcome, don't watch YouTube in your car. I think we can state that.
I think that's pretty solid.
After your commute, consider subscribing to Bloomberg Podcasts, where we're just blown away by the first year's response. David Gura, let us continue, if we can. What does President Trump think of these events? Has he completely ignored them, or does he and presumptive designate Secretary Rubio, do they monitor this and adjust to it through December into January?
Well, he hasn't weighed in yet. We've been scouring his various social media feeds to see if he will or if he'll release a statement from his transition team. That hasn't happened yet, but I'm sure he's watching it closely. And he, of course, has said during the course of the campaign and into this transition, he thinks that he can end this war very effectively and very quickly. We'll see if the rubber hits the road there in terms of how that actually happens. But we can juxtapose that with what we've heard from President Biden's camp, with the current president, a National Security Council official today telling Bloomberg News that the U.S. doesn't plan to respond in kind to that escalation in Russia's nuclear doctrine. So the wheels are still in motion. This White House is still approaching this conflict as though it's in charge, which of course it is. But we have yet to hear what's going to happen from what the former president turned future president would do in this situation, what he wants to see happen going forward.
David, Brazil, where you've been for the last several days and where the G20 is taking place, is such a major economy in that part of the world. Give us just your sense of kind of how things are in Brazil.
Well, we have President Lula back in power after leaving office for several years. He enjoys a lot of popular support here. We're seeing a very interesting dynamic, kind of interpersonal dynamic between him and President Milei in Argentina, who is a much Trumpier character, to use that neologism, somebody who's friendly with Donald Trump, and I think as we look forward here is likely to be a very close ally of Donald Trump when he returns to the White House. But this is a big, thriving economy, of course, and what we've seen over the course of the last couple of days is Brazil laying the groundwork for more robust and even deeper economic relations with all the countries who are gathered here.
Quickly, David, one anecdote on Brazil. Somebody emailed me and said, Gura's where it's fancy. There's another Brazil. Give us one anecdote about your time in Rio.
We've traveled around here a little bit, of course. I wanted to see Sugarloaf Mountain, wanted to see Christ the Redeemer, those statues. You don't have to move far afield from the very touristy stretch we're on now to get to those parts of this city. This is a massive city, so is Sao Paulo. Again, it's a country with many millions of people. But I will say the president of this country declared a holiday for the G20 meeting. So a lot of folks who are here are continuing to go to the beach, which you see behind me here. But plenty of others decided to decamp for other places as they could, just given the way that a conference like this, a summit like this, weighs on a city.
David Gura with further reporting through the day, the headlines from Moscow and from Washington, and of course Kyiv as well. David Gura in Rio at the G20 meetings. The tape moderately improves. I don't want to sell this to you too large. Negative 550 on futures. We got negative 200. Right now, negative 360. Futures back to S&P, open. S&P trading negative 30, 0.5% as well. The VIX out to a 17 handle for a cup of Sanka. We're back to 16.87, Paul.
Yeah, looking at the yield front, Tom. Yields come in here today modestly. The 10-year Treasury is off about 4 basis points, 4.37%. And the 2-year at 4.25%. So still a little steepening in the yield curve, just not as much as we had seen before.
Alex stealing you yesterday. Did you know how to talk to each other?
Oh, yeah.
Must have been great.
No problem at all. Just like getting
Tears,
right back.
Hugs.
Yep, all good stuff. She's back, ready to go. And we talked a lot of energy, which we tend to do with Alex.
I have
and
never
oil
seen
and
Alex steal without energy.
Exactly. So we'll be starting up here in just a few minutes.
Huge response to playing Benny King and Mickey Geely. Seal, stand by me.
No, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. So darling, darling.